Wyoming Territory, 1885. The blizzard came without warning, white fury that erased the horizon and turned the world into a howling void. Nathaniel Nate Reeves pulled his coat tighter against the biting wind, cursing himself for ignoring the heavy clouds that had gathered throughout the afternoon. At 45, he'd spent enough years in open country to know better. The small trail he'd been following had disappeared completely under the rapidly accumulating snow, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. Through the curtain of white, Nate spotted a dark shape too angular to be natural. Urging his exhausted horse forward, he made out the silhouette of an abandoned church, its steeple listing slightly against the gray sky. The weathered sign hanging by a single chain creaked in the wind. Grace Chapel, all welcome in the Lord's house. Not much of a house anymore, Nate muttered, dismounting and leading his horse Thunder to the sheltered side of the building. The animal's breath came in great white plumes as Nate removed the saddle and bridle, rubbing him down with a blanket from his pack. Sorry about this, old friend. Not the accommodations I promised. The church door protested loudly when Nate pushed it open, as if it hadn't welcomed a visitor in years. Inside, the single room was illuminated only by what little daylight filtered through the snow-covered windows. Pews were scattered haphazardly, some broken and overturned. The altar remained, though the cross that once hung above it was gone. Nate worked efficiently, falling into the routine that 12 years of wandering had perfected. He gathered the driest wood he could find from the collapsed section of the roof, built a small fire in the cast iron stove that remained in one corner, and set up his bedroll near its warmth. Only when these essential tasks were complete did he allow himself to relax, settling onto a pew that seemed sturdy enough to hold his weight. The wind howled outside, finding every crack and crevice in the old building, making the flame in the stove dance and cast long shadows. Nate reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a battered tin cup and a small bottle of whiskey, his defense against the cold, and the memories that always seemed to find him in the quiet moments. As he poured a measure of the amber liquid, his eyes were drawn to something protruding from the hymnal rack on the pew across from him. It was a Bible, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. Something about it, perhaps the way it seemed to be deliberately placed, piqued his curiosity. Setting down his cup, Nate reached for the book. When he opened it, a folded piece of paper slipped from between its pages and fluttered to the floor. The paper was yellowed with age, the creases so worn they had almost separated. Carefully, he unfolded it to reveal handwriting in faded ink, a woman's hand, elegant but hurried. "My dearest Thomas," it began. "By the time you read these words, I will have left this world. The doctor says the fever is beyond his skill, and I feel my strength fading with each hour. I am not afraid for myself, but my heart breaks knowing I must leave you and our little James." Nate's hands began to tremble, a reaction no winter chill had ever produced. "Please know that you gave me a life filled with more joy than I ever thought possible. I have no regrets, save one that I won't see our son grow into the man I know he will become under your guidance." He should stop reading. This letter wasn't meant for his eyes. It was sacred private. And yet he couldn't look away, drawn by words that echoed too closely with ghosts from his own past. "I have one final request, my love. When your grief has softened enough to allow it, please open your heart again. Find someone who will bring light back into your life and love for our son. I love you forever, but I ask you to find happiness after me. This is my final promise I ask of you. All my love, Margaret." Nate's vision blurred. He refolded the letter with unsteady hands and returned it to the Bible, closing the book gently as if it contained something infinitely fragile. Reaching into his shirt, he pulled out a silver chain that held a simple gold ring and another letter folded and refolded so many times that the creases had worn through in places. He didn't need to open it. He knew every word by heart. "I love you forever, but I ask you to find happiness after me. This is my final promise I ask of you. All my love, Eleanor." Almost the exact same words, written by his Eleanor 12 years ago as she lay dying of fever while he was away fighting a war that suddenly meant nothing when measured against what he had lost. Nate tossed back his whiskey in one burning swallow. In 12 years of wandering, he had never found a sign that felt so personal, so directed at him specifically. He wasn't a superstitious man. His years as a Union intelligence sergeant during the war had beaten that out of him, but this coincidence sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the blizzard. "Is this you, Eleanor?" he whispered to the empty church. Are you still trying to make me keep that promise? Only the wind answered, whistling through the broken windows like a woman's satsa. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Cottonwood Springs appeared on the horizon like a painting, a cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by white-capped mountains. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals against the clear blue sky, a sign of warmth and life that Nate had learned to appreciate from a distance. He'd made his decision during the long night in the abandoned church. He would stop in town just long enough to resupply and then continue west. The strange coincidence of the letter had unsettled him more than he cared to admit, stirring up memories and feelings he'd spent years burying. Cottonwood Springs was like 100 other frontier towns. Nate had passed through a main street lined with essential businesses, a few side streets with modest homes, and the inevitable saloon that served as the social center for men with too much time and too little hope. He tied Thunder to the hitching post outside the general store, patting the horse's neck affectionately before stepping inside. The bell above the door announced his arrival, drawing the attention of the storekeeper, a round-faced man with spectacles perched on his nose. Afternoon, stranger, the man called out cheerfully. Walter Jenkins, at your service. What can I help you with today? Just passing through, Nate replied, his voice rough from disuse. Need some coffee, bacon, flour, and beans. Whatever tobacco you've got, too. As Jenkins gathered the supplies, Nate surveyed the store. A woman stood at the far counter, examining a bolt of blue calico fabric. She was tall and straight-backed, with dark hair pulled into a practical bun at the nape of her neck. Something in her posture, a quiet dignity, despite the obvious patches on her dress, caught his attention. The front door burst open, letting in a blast of cold air, and a boy of about 10, red-faced and breathless. Mrs. Watson, the boy exclaimed. You gotta come quick. Billy Granger's at your place again, and he's real mad about them medicines. The woman, Mrs. Watson, set down the fabric, immediately her expression shifting from surprise to resignation and then to determination. Thank you, Tommy, she said calmly. Run and tell Sheriff Wilson, would you? I'll head home now. Sheriff's out at the Peterson place, the boy replied. Won't be back till evening. A flicker of worry crossed her face, quickly mastered. I see. Well, run along home then. I'll handle Billy. As she moved toward the door, Nate noticed her right hand slip into her pocket, emerging with brass knuckles that she discreetly slid onto her fingers. The incongruity of it, this proper-looking woman with a weapon clearly meant for close combat, almost made him smile. Almost. Jenkins leaned across the counter toward Nate. That's Clara Watson, he said in a low voice. Runs the apothecary in a small farm outside town. Widow. Billy Granger's have been causing trouble since she refused to sell him laudanum without a prescription. Nate nodded, keeping his expression neutral. It wasn't his business. He was just passing through as always. How much for the supplies, he asked, reaching for his money pouch. By the time he'd paid and loaded his purchases into his saddlebags, curiosity, a trait he thought he had long suppressed, got the better of him. He untied Thunder and led him down the street toward the small building with a painted sign reading, Watson's Apothecary and Medicinal Herbs. The shouting was audible from half a block away. You uppity bitch, a male voice bellowed. Who do you think you are, denying me what's rightfully mine? My back's killing me. Your back would feel better if you spent less time at Thornton's saloon and more time sober, Mr. Granger. The woman's voice was calm but firm. Nate rounded the corner just in time to see a burly man with a week's worth of beard lunge toward Clara Watson, who stood on the steps of her shop. Before Nate could intervene, she sidestepped with surprising grace and delivered a sharp jab to the man's kidney with her brass-knuckled fist. Granger howled in pain and staggered but didn't fall, his face contorted with rage. You'll pay for that, he snarled, reaching for something at his waist. The glint of metal was all Nate needed to see. In 3 long strides, he closed the distance between them, his hand shooting out to grasp Granger's wrist, just as the knife cleared its sheath. With a practiced twist, he forced the man's arm behind his back at an unnatural angle, bringing him to his knees. I believe the lady made her position clear, Nate said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from giving orders in life-or-death situations. Granger struggled briefly, then went still as Nate increased the pressure on his wrist. Who the hell are you? He spat. Nobody, Nate replied. Just passing through. He relieved Granger of his knife and tossed it into a nearby water trough. Now I suggest you go sober up like the lady recommended. He released Granger's wrist and stepped back, maintaining a relaxed posture that belied his readiness. 12 years of drifting through frontier towns had taught him that men like Granger usually bent down when confronted with someone who clearly knew how to handle themselves, but not always. Granger rose slowly, rubbing his wrist, his eyes darting between Nate and Clara. For a moment it seemed he might try his luck, but something in Nate's steady gaze must have convinced him otherwise. "This ain't over, Clara," he muttered, backing away. "And you stranger, you best watch your back." "I always do," Nate replied mildly. Only when Granger had disappeared around the corner did Nate turn to Clara Watson. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, early 30s perhaps, with intelligent brown eyes that regarded him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "I appreciate the assistance," she said, slipping the brass knuckles back into her pocket. "Reeves, Nathaniel Reeves. Most call me Nate." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Though it looked like you were handling things fine on your own." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I was. Billy Granger has more bluster than bite usually, but thank you all the same." She studied him with a directness that few women possessed. "You're bleeding." Nate glanced down, surprised to see a thin line of blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. "Must have caught it on his knife. It's nothing. It needs cleaning at the very least. I have supplies inside." She gestured toward the door of her shop. "It's the least I can offer in return for your help." Nate hesitated. His rule had always been to avoid entanglements of any kind. They led to connections, and connections led to pain when they were inevitably severed. But the cut was starting to sting, and there was something about Clara Watson's no-nonsense manner that put him at ease. "All right," he conceded. "Just a quick clean and bandage." The interior of the apothecary was unlike any Nate had seen before. Instead of the usual dusty shelves of patent medicines and tonics of dubious efficacy, Clara's shop was meticulously organized with labeled jars of herbs, tinctures, and compounds. A large work table dominated the back half of the room, covered with mortar and pestles, scales, and what appeared to be scientific equipment. "You run this place alone?" he asked, taking a seat on the stool she indicated. "I do now," she replied, gathering supplies. "My husband started it. He was a doctor, a real one trained at Harvard Medical College." There was pride in her voice, but no self-pity. She rolled up his sleeve with efficient movements. "This might sting." The antiseptic solution did more than sting, it burned like hellfire. Nate didn't flinch, but Clara noticed his controlled reaction. "Military man," she asked, not looking up from her work. Nate stiffened slightly. "What makes you say that?" "The way you handled Granger. Efficient, no wasted movement. The way you're sitting now, back straight, eyes constantly checking exits and entrances." She began applying a salve that smelled of honey and something sharper. "And the scars on your arm, those aren't from farm work or bar fights." Before Nate could respond, the back door opened and a small figure burst into the room. "Mama, Mr. Abernathy says Buttercup's ready to fold, but..." The girl stopped short at the sight of Nate, her words cutting off abruptly. She was perhaps 8 years old with the same dark hair as her mother, though hers hung in 2 neat braids. Her dress was well-worn but clean, and her eyes, a striking blue that must have come from her father, regarded Nate with unabashed curiosity. "Victoria Watson," Clara said, not pausing in her work. "This is Mr. Reeves. He helped me with a situation outside. Mr. Reeves, my daughter." "Most people call me Tori," the girl said, approaching with a confidence rare in children her age. She studied him openly, her head tilted slightly. "You've been in a fight." "Just a misunderstanding," Nate replied, surprised to find himself smiling slightly. Tori nodded sagely. "Billy Granger. He's always causing trouble. Mama says he has demons he's trying to drown, but they know how to swim." Clara shot her daughter a look that was half exasperation, half amusement. "That was a private conversation, Victoria." "Sorry, Mama." Tori didn't sound particularly sorry. She continued to study Nate with an intensity that was almost disconcerting. "Do you know how to shoe a horse, Mr. Reeves?" "I do," he answered, somewhat taken aback by the abrupt change of subject. The girl's face lit up. "Can you teach me? Mama's been trying, but the nails always bend when I try to hammer them." "Victoria," Claire interrupted, tying off Nate's bandage with a neat knot. Mr. Reeves is just passing through. He doesn't have time for horseshoeing lessons. Actually, Tori continued, ignoring her mother's hint. Mama needs someone who knows horses, and I need a father. The straightforward declaration hung in the air like a physical thing. Clara's hands froze in the act of gathering her supplies, a flush rising to her cheeks. Victoria Eleanor Watson, she said, her voice tight with embarrassment. That is quite enough. Please go check on him, Buttercup, and tell Mr. Abernathy and I'll be there shortly. Tori held her ground for a moment, looking between her mother and Nate with those two perceptive eyes. Then, with a small sigh that seemed to carry the weight of long disappointment, she nodded. Yes, Mama. She turned to Nate and offered a small curtsy that seemed at odds with her previous directness. It was nice to meet you, Mr. Reeves. After she had gone, Clara busied herself putting away the medical supplies, her movements betraying her discomfort. I apologize for my daughter's forthrightness. She has a habit of speaking her mind without considering the consequences. No need to apologize, Nate said, rolling down his sleeve. Children see the world differently than we do. Yes, well, in this case, she sees a world that doesn't exist. Clara turned to face him, her composure recovered. Thank you again for your help with Billy. The bandage should hold for a few days. Keep it clean and dry. It was a dismissal, polite but clear. Nate stood, touching the brim of his hat again. Ma'am. He turned to leave, relieved to be heading back to the simplicity of the trail and solitude. As he stepped outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. He had intended to resupply and move on immediately, but the encounter with Granger had delayed him. It would be foolish to start a journey this late in the day, especially with another storm threatening on the horizon. One night in town wouldn't hurt. He'd find the local boarding house, get a hot meal, and be on his way at first light. He was halfway to the saloon when a voice called out behind him. Mr. Reeves, a moment of your time, if you please. Nate turned to see two men approaching, one tall and distinguished, with silver hair and an expensive coat, the other, shorter and rounder, wearing the collar of a clergyman. I'm Mayor Edward Hayes, the taller man said, extending his hand, and this is Reverend Daniel Parker. We witnessed what happened outside the apothecary. That was quite impressive. Nate shook the offered hand briefly. Just happened to be passing by. Nonetheless, you handled a delicate situation with admirable restraint. Mayor Hayes continued. Billy Granger can be problematic when he's been drinking. Mrs. Watson has had more than her share of troubles with him. Clara is one of our most valued citizens, Reverend Parker added. A remarkable woman, especially considering all she's endured. Nate recognized the look the two men exchanged. They were sizing him up, measuring him for some purpose he couldn't yet discern. He'd seen that look often enough during the war, usually right before someone tried to recruit him for a dangerous mission. If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, he said, taking a step back. I need to find lodging for the night. Of course, Mayor Hayes nodded. Thornton's saloon has rooms upstairs. Clean enough, though a bit noisy. He hesitated, then added in a lowered voice, Mr. Reeves, might I have a private word with you before you retire for the evening? Perhaps over dinner at my home? Say 7 o'clock. Nate's instinct was to refuse, but something in the mayor's expression, a genuine concern that seemed at odds with the usual political mask, gave him pause. It's about Mrs. Watson, Hayes added quietly, a matter of some delicacy. Curiosity, that dangerous trait, again stirred within Nate. 7 o'clock, he agreed reluctantly. As he walked away, he couldn't help but wonder what he was getting himself into. The letter in the abandoned church, the encounter with Clara Watson and her surprisingly direct daughter, and now this mysterious dinner invitation, it was more involvement with strangers than he'd allowed himself in years. Eleanor's words from the letter echoed in his mind, find happiness after me. And he pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the practical matter of securing a room for the night. One night in Cottonwood Springs and then he'd be gone. That was all. Whatever troubles these people had were not his concern, no matter what strange coincidences the universe seemed to be throwing in his path. Mayor Hayes's home was the finest in Cottonwood Springs, a 2-story structure with actual glass windows and a wraparound porch. It stood apart from the other buildings on a gentle rise that afforded a view of the entire town and the mountains beyond. As Nate approached, he noted the strategic value of such a position, old habits from his military days that he'd never quite shaken. He was greeted at the door by a housekeeper who took his coat and hat and led him to a well-appointed dining room. Mayor Hayes was already seated at the head of the table with Reverend Parker to his right. A third place had been set to Hayes' left. Mr. Reeves, Hayes rose to greet him. Thank you for joining us. Please sit. The meal was simple but well-prepared: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread, a luxury by frontier standards. The conversation remained general throughout dinner. The weather, the town's history, innocuous topics that required little from Nate beyond occasional nods of acknowledgement. Only when the housekeeper had cleared the plates and served coffee did Hayes get to the point. Mr. Reeves, he began, setting down his cup. How much do you know about Mrs. Watson's situation? Nothing beyond what I saw today, Nate replied honestly. She runs the apothecary, has a daughter, and apparently doesn't care for Billy Granger. Reverend Parker chuckled softly. No one cares for Billy Granger, especially when he's in his cups. But that's not our concern tonight. Hayes leaned forward, his expression serious. Clara Watson came to Cottonwood Springs 5 years ago with her daughter and what little they could carry in one wagon. Her husband, Dr. James Watson, had been killed in a stagecoach robbery 3 months prior. He was traveling to help a woman in difficult labor when the coach was attacked. James was a Union Army surgeon during the war, Parker added. A brilliant man by all accounts. He established the apothecary here with the intention of bringing modern medical practices to the frontier, combined with traditional remedies he'd studied with various native tribes. Nate took a sip of coffee, keeping his expression neutral despite the unexpected mention of the war. Admirable goals. Mrs. Watson seems to be carrying on his work competently. She is, Hayes agreed. Clara was a nurse during the war herself. That's where she met James. She's not just maintaining the apothecary. She's advancing his research, particularly in herbal treatments for fever and infection. Her medicines have saved lives in this town when conventional treatments failed. Including my own, Parker interjected, touching his chest. Pneumonia last winter. The doctor from Boulder gave me up for lost, but Clara's treatments pulled me through. Nate nodded, still unsure why they were telling him this. I'm glad to hear it, but I'm not sure what this has to do with me. As I told you, I'm just passing through. Hayes and Parker exchanged a glance, and then Hayes leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mr. Reeves, Clara Watson is in danger of losing everything: her apothecary, her small farm, her home. And the threat comes from a man named Ezra Blackwood. The banker, Parker explained. He owns the mortgage on Clara's property. Blackwood has had his eye on Clara since she arrived, Hayes continued. First as a potential wife, she refused him, of course, and now as a business opportunity. He's found a clause in her mortgage agreement that allows him to call in the full amount if the property is not properly maintained by a male head of household. Nate's jaw tightened. He'd seen such predatory tactics before: legal theft dressed up in banking language. That's an unusual clause. Not as unusual as you might think, especially for a woman-owned business. Hayes sighed. James took out the mortgage to expand the apothecary just before his death. The bank added that clause without fully explaining it. Now Blackwood is using it to pressure Clara. He wants to marry her, Parker said bluntly, or failing that, force her to sell the property to him at a fraction of its worth. Either way, he gets what he wants. Nate set down his coffee cup carefully. This is unfortunate, but I still don't see how it concerns me. Hayes sat back, studying Nate with shrewd eyes. You're a military man, Mr. Reeves, Union Army, if I had to guess. The way you handled Billy Granger today showed training and discipline. Nate neither confirmed nor denied the assessment. You seem to be working toward a proposition, Mayor Hayes. I'd appreciate it if you'd get to it directly. Very well, Hayes nodded. Clara needs help, practical help with her property to satisfy the maintenance clause, and perhaps protection from Blackwood's less subtle pressures. We believe you could provide both, at least temporarily. You want me to work for Mrs. Watson? It wasn't a question. Just until she can find a more permanent solution, Parker said quickly. A few weeks, perhaps a month. Room and board in exchange for labor and presence. Nate stood his chair, scraping against the wooden floor. I appreciate your concern for Mrs. Watson, gentlemen, but I'm not looking for employment. I'll be moving on tomorrow. Hayes rose as well, his expression resigned but not surprised. Of course, I understand completely. Please forgive the presumption. As the housekeeper brought Nate's coat and hat, Hayes added casually, "It's a shame, really. Clara Watson is one of the finest women I've ever known. Brilliant, dedicated, strong in ways most men can't comprehend. And that daughter of hers, extraordinary child, sharp as a tack and brave as a lion cub. They deserve better than what Blackwood has planned for them." "I'm sure they do," Nate replied, pulling on his coat. "But there must be other men in town who could help." Parker shook his head sadly. "Most are either afraid of Blackwood, who controls their mortgages as well, or not the kind of men we'd want around a vulnerable widow and her daughter." Nate buttoned his coat, feeling a familiar weight settling in his chest, the burden of others' expectations, their needs, their pain. He'd carried that weight during the war, and it had nearly crushed him. After Eleanor and Jacob died, he'd sworn never to take it up again. "Good night, gentlemen," he said firmly. "Thank you for the meal." As he walked back to the saloon through the cold night air, Nate tried to push away the images that Hayes and Parker had planted in his mind. Clara Watson losing her home and livelihood, that bright-eyed child Tori forced into who knows what kind of situation. It wasn't his problem. He had his own ghost to outrun. The saloon was still rowdy when he returned, the piano player hammering out a tune that competed with the raucous laughter and occasional shouts of the patrons. Nate avoided the main room, heading straight for the stairs that led to the rented rooms above. His sleep was restless, haunted by dreams of Eleanor and Jacob, their faces gradually morphing into those of Clara and Tori Watson. In the dream, they all stood on the porch of a burning house, reaching out to him as he remained frozen, unable to move, unable to save them. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cold room. Enough, he thought grimly. It was time to move on, away from this town and its troubles, away from the ghosts that seemed determined to find him no matter how far he ran. The stable was quiet as Nate approached, lantern in hand. He'd paid for Thunder's keep the night before and expected to find the horse fed and rested, ready for the journey ahead. Instead, he found the stable boy Tommy from the general store examining Thunder's right front hoof with a worried expression. "Morning," Nate said, setting down his lantern. "Something wrong with my horse." Tommy jumped, nearly dropping the hoof. "Mr. Reeves, I was just about to come find you. Your horse threw a shoe yesterday, and when I went to check this morning, I found his hoofs split right down the middle." Nate knelt beside Thunder, taking the hoof from Tommy to examine it himself. The split was significant, a serious injury that would only worsen with travel. "He must have caught it on something when you were riding in," Tommy explained. "With a split like that, he can't carry weight for at least a week, maybe 2. Nate stroked Thunder's neck, feeling the animal lean into his touch. The horse had been with him for 8 years, the closest thing to a constant companion he had allowed himself. "Is there a blacksmith in town?" he asked, already knowing what the answer would be. A town this size wouldn't have a dedicated smithy. "No, sir," Tommy confirmed. "Mr. Blackwood says the town's not big enough to support one. Nearest is in Boulder, 30 miles east." Nate considered his options. He could buy another horse, but good mounts were scarce and expensive in these parts. He could wait for Thunder to heal, but that meant staying in Cottonwood Springs, the very place he was eager to leave. Or he could walk, leading Thunder until they reached the next town, but that would slow his journey considerably and risk worsening the horse's injury. "I can treat the hoof," a voice said from behind him. "At least enough to stabilize it until it starts to heal properly." Nate turned to find Clara Watson standing in the stable doorway, a leather medical bag in her hand. She was dressed for the day's work in a practical brown dress, with a blue shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. "Mrs. Watson," he nodded, straightening up. "You're about early." "I was on my way to check on Buttercup and her new foal," she explained, setting down her bag and approaching Thunder with calm, confident movements. "Tommy mentioned your horse's trouble when he came to collect some liniment for me yesterday." She knelt beside Thunder, who regarded her with cautious interest. With gentle hands, she examined the split hoof, making soft clicking sounds that seemed to soothe the animal. "It's a clean split," she announced after a moment. "I can create a patch with pine resin and horsehair that will hold it together while it heals. But he'll need rest at least a week, preferably 2. Nate ran a hand through his hair, frustration warring with resignation. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Watson, but I'd planned to leave today." Clara stood, brushing stable dust from her skirt. "Plans change, Mr. Reeves. Unless you intend to abandon your horse or walk 30 miles to Boulder, you're staying in Cottonwood Springs for the time being." There was something refreshing about her directness, even as it irritated him. Most women of his acquaintance, admittedly few in recent years, couched their words in layers of politeness that obscured their true meaning. Clara Watson said exactly what she thought. I can pay for his care and collect him in a few weeks, Nate suggested, knowing, even as he spoke, that he wouldn't abandon Thunder. Clara raised an eyebrow. And where will you be in the meantime? Walking to the next town? Buying another horse you can't afford? She shook her head. No, Mr. Reeves, I think you are meant to stay a while longer. The echo of Eleanor's letter from the abandoned church flashed through Nate's mind, sending an uncomfortable prickle down his spine. Meant to stay, as if some invisible hand was arranging events to keep him here. I'll stable him at my place, Clara continued, apparently taking his silence for agreement. I have space, and Tori will be delighted to help care for him. She has a way with animals. I can't accept charity, Mrs. Watson, Nate said stiffly. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. It's not charity I'm offering, Mr. Reeves. She glanced around the stable, then lowered her voice slightly. I assume Mayor Hayes spoke with you last night. Nate nodded reluctantly. Then you know I need help. Practical help from someone who knows horses and isn't afraid of hard work. She straightened, meeting his gaze directly. I propose a simple exchange room and board in return for your labor. For 2 weeks until your horse heals. After that, you're free to go, and I'll be in a better position with the bank. Nate studied her face, searching for signs of the desperation Hayes had described. He found none, only a clear-eyed pragmatism and the quiet dignity he'd noticed when he first saw her in the general store. Why me? He asked finally. You don't know anything about me. I know you didn't kill Billy Granger when you had the chance, she replied evenly. I know you handle yourself like a man with military training. I know you care enough about your horse to consider his welfare above your own convenience. She lifted her chin slightly. That's more than I know about most men who pass through Cottonwood Springs. Before Nate could respond, the stable door opened again, and Reverend Parker entered, looking somewhat surprised to find them there. Mrs. Watson, Mr. Reeves, he greeted them with a nod. I was just coming to check on the new foal. Tommy mentioned the blessed event when he passed by the church. She delivered safely last night, Clara replied. A healthy filly chestnut with 4 white socks. Tori's already named her Penny. Wonderful news, Parker smiled. His eyes moved to Thunder, still holding his injured hoof slightly off the ground. And what's this? Your horse is injured, Mr. Reeves. Split hoof, Nate confirmed reluctantly. Mrs. Watson was just offering to treat it at her farm. Ah, Parker's expression brightened. And you'll be staying to help with repairs while your horse recovers. Excellent, excellent. The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? Nate shot Clara a sharp look, suspecting a setup, but her surprise seemed as genuine as his own. Apparently, Reverend Parker had jumped to his own conclusions. Nothing's been decided, Nate said firmly. Actually, Clara interjected, Mr. Reeves has agreed to stay for 2 weeks, just until his horse heals. Nate opened his mouth to correct her, then closed it again. What choice did he really have? Thunder needed rest and treatment. He needed somewhere to stay while the horse recovered. And Clara Watson needed help. It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. 2 weeks, he agreed reluctantly, just until Thunder's hoof heals. Then I'll be moving on. The look that passed between Clara and Reverend Parker wasn't lost on Nate. Relief mingled with something that looked suspiciously like triumph. He had the distinct feeling he'd just been outmaneuvered, though he couldn't quite see how. I'll need to collect my things from the saloon, he said, resigned to his fate. Of course, Clara nodded. We'll prepare Thunder for the journey to my farm. It's not far, just beyond the north edge of town. As Nate left the stable, he couldn't shake the sensation that he was making a mistake. 2 weeks in one place with one family was more involvement than he'd allowed himself in years. It meant conversations, connections, the inevitable questions about his past. And yet, as he gathered his few possessions from the rented room, he found himself thinking of Tori Watson's direct blue gaze and her startling declaration. Mama needs someone who knows horses, and I need a father. Not me, child, he murmured to the empty room. Not me. Clara Watson's farm sat nestled in a small valley a mile north of Cottonwood Springs, sheltered from the worst of the Wyoming winds by a natural ridge to the west. As they approached, Nate walking beside Thunder, while Clara led the way in a small wagon with Tori beside her, he assessed the property with a military eye, noting its vulnerabilities and defensible positions out of long habit. The main house was modest but solid built of local timber, with a stone foundation and a porch that wrapped around two sides. A barn stood 30 yards away, weathered but structurally sound. Beyond that, fenced pastures held a few cattle and horses, including a chestnut mare with a newborn foal tucked against her side. A kitchen garden, now dormant for winter, stretched behind the house. A small creek cut through the property, partially frozen but still flowing. It was a good piece of land, Nate acknowledged, fertile, well situated with abundant water. The kind of place a man might settle if he were looking to put down roots, which he wasn't. "We're home," Tori called out as they entered the yard, bouncing on the wagon seat with excitement. "Mr. Reeves is going to stay with us and fix things and teach me to shoe horses." Clara shot Nate an apologetic glance. "I may have mentioned your skill with horses to Tori. She's been eager to learn since her father promised to teach her before he—" She trailed off, then cleared her throat. "Well, she's eager to learn." "I understand," Nate said quietly. And he did. He knew all too well the weight of promises left unfulfilled by death. They settled Thunder in the barn, where Clara applied a poultice to the split hoof and wrapped it securely. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had treated many injuries, human and animal alike. Tori watched intently, asking questions that revealed a surprising knowledge of equine anatomy for a child her age. "Papa's books," she explained when Nate commented on this. "I read them all the time. Mama says I'm going to be a doctor someday like Papa was." "You certainly have the curiosity for it," Nate replied, finding himself smiling at her enthusiasm despite his determination to maintain emotional distance. The tour of the house that followed was brief. It was a simple structure, a main room with a stone fireplace that served as both kitchen and living area. Two small bedrooms and a separate room off the kitchen that had been converted into a laboratory of sorts with shelves of dried herbs, tinctures, and medical equipment. "You'll stay here," Clara said, showing him to a small room off the main living area. It had once been a pantry, Nate guessed, now fitted with a narrow bed, a chair, and a small table. "It's not much, but it's private." "It's fine," Nate assured her, setting down his pack. He'd slept in far worse places over the years. "Supper's at 6, she continued. "We keep country hours here, up at dawn, work till dusk. I spend mornings at the apothecary in town and afternoons here. Tori has lessons with Reverend Parker in the mornings and helps me here afterward." Nate nodded, absorbing the rhythm of their lives. "What needs doing first?" he asked, eager to establish the practical nature of their arrangement. Clara seemed to appreciate his directness. "The roof has several leaks that need patching before the next snow. The barn door needs new hinges. The corral fence has 3 broken rails, and the pump handle for the well is loose." She paused, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face. "I've tried to keep up with everything, but there's only so much I can do alone." "I'll start with the roof," Nate decided. "Best to have shelter secure before the weather turns again." And so began Nate's temporary life at the Watson farm. The first day he spent hours on the roof replacing damaged shingles and sealing leaks with pine tar. The work was straightforward but satisfying, the kind of tangible task with visible results that he'd always preferred. From his vantage point on the roof, he could see Clara in the garden, harvesting what looked like roots from plants that had survived the first frosts. Tori moved between the house and barn, carrying out her chores with the serious dedication of a child determined to prove her worth. They worked together like a well-oiled machine, each knowing their role without needing direction. It reminded him painfully of his own small family before the war, and disease had torn it apart. Eleanor working in their kitchen garden, while Jacob chased butterflies between the rows of vegetables. The memory, usually carefully suppressed, rose so vividly that Nate had to stop working for a moment, gripping the hammer tightly until the wave of grief subsided. By dusk, the roof was repaired, and Nate had moved on to fixing the barn door hinges. He worked until Clara called him for supper, using physical labor to keep memories at bay. The meal was simple but hearty: rabbit stew, cornbread, and preserved peaches. They ate at a scrubbed wooden table in the main room, the fireplace providing both warmth and light. To Nate's relief, neither Clara nor Tori pressed him with personal questions. Instead, the conversation centered on the day's work and plans for tomorrow. "Mr. Abernathy says Penny's the finest foal he's seen in years," Tori reported, her face animated. "He thinks she'll be fast enough for racing when she grows up." "Mr. Abernathy says that about every foal born in the county," Clara replied with fond exasperation. But she is a fine-looking filly. Can I start training her mama? Mr. Reeves could help me. He knows horses. Clara glanced at Nate, a question in her eyes. Training a foal is a long process, Tori. Mr. Reeves won't be here that long. But, Tori began, her face falling. I can show you how to start. Nate interrupted, surprising himself. The early handling is most important anyway, getting her used to human touch and voice. You can continue after I'm gone. Tori's smile could have lit the whole room. Really, you'll teach me? If your mother agrees, Nate added, suddenly aware he might be overstepping. Of course, Clara said softly. That would be very kind of you, Mr. Reeves. That night, after Tori had been tucked into bed and Clara had retired to her laboratory to work on her medicines, Nate sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. The night was cold, but still the silence broken only by the occasional cry of a distant coyote. It was the kind of peace he usually found only on the trail far from towns and people. Yet here he was on a stranger's porch, feeling something dangerously close to contentment. A movement caught his eye, Tori's small face peering at him through her bedroom window. When she saw him notice her, she waved shyly. Without thinking, Nate raised his hand in return, a simple gesture that somehow felt momentous. The child disappeared from the window, but the impact of that small exchange lingered. For the first time in years, someone was looking at him not as a drifter or a potential threat, but as a person who mattered, whose presence was welcome. It was dangerous, this feeling. It would make leaving harder when the time came. And the time would come in 2 weeks when Thunder's hoof was healed. He would ride away from this place and these people as he had from countless others before. He had to remember that, had to guard against the treacherous warmth that Clara and Tori Watson's home offered. He'd learned the hard way that warmth was temporary, that happiness was fleeting, that attachment led only to devastating loss. And yet, as he sat listening to the night sounds of the small farm, Nate couldn't help but wonder if he was fighting a battle he'd already begun to lose. The next morning brought the first real challenge to Nate's determination to remain emotionally detached. He was repairing the corral fence when Tori approached, leading a reluctant Penny on a soft rope. The foal was barely a day old, all gangly legs and wary eyes. Mr. Reeves, Tori called, her voice carrying a note of urgency. Can you help? Penny won't let me touch her ears. Mama says if she's not handled right from the start, she'll be hard to bridle later. Nate set down his tools and approached slowly, careful not to startle the nervous foal. You're right about that, he said, keeping his voice low and calm. Horses remember their first experiences with humans for their whole lives. He knelt beside Penny, not touching her, yet just letting her become accustomed to his presence. The trick is to make her think touching her ears was her idea, not yours. Tori watched with rapt attention as Nate demonstrated, gently scratching Penny's neck, then gradually moving his hand upward until he was stroking her ears. The foal remained calm, eventually leaning into his touch. Now you try, he instructed, guiding Tori's small hand through the same motions. Gentle, that's it. Let her come to you. The look of wonder on Tori's face when Penny accepted her touch made something twist in Nate's chest, a feeling both painful and sweet. It was the same expression Jacob had worn when Nate taught him to fish in the creek behind their home, that mixture of pride and joy at mastering a new skill. I'm doing it, Tori whispered, her blue eyes wide with excitement. She likes me. Of course she does, Nate replied, finding himself smiling. Animals know good people when they meet them. When they spent the next hour working with Penny, teaching her to accept handling and all over her body, to follow the gentle pressure of the lead rope, to stand quietly when asked. Tori proved to be a natural with horses, patient and intuitive beyond her years. Papa promised to teach me about horses when I was old enough, she said as they led Penny back to her mother. There was no sadness in her voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that struck Nate as both brave and heartbreaking. He said every doctor should know horses, because sometimes that's the only way to reach patients in the country. Your father sounds like a wise man, Nate said carefully. Tori nodded. He was. Mama says he was the smartest man she ever knew and the kindest. He saved lots of people during the war, even enemy soldiers. She looked up at Nate with those two perceptive eyes. Were you in the war, Mr. Reeves? The question caught him off guard. What makes you ask that? You have the same look in your eyes that Papa had sometimes, like you're seeing things that aren't there anymore. She didn't wait for his answer, continuing in that forthright way of hers. Papa said the war made ghosts that follow men home. Do you have ghosts, Mr. Reeves? Nate was saved from having to respond by Clara's arrival. She came around the corner of the barn carrying a basket of what appeared to be freshly harvested herbs. There you are, she said, her expression softening at the sight of Tori with the foal. How's Penny doing? Mr. Reeves showed me how to touch her ears and feet, Tori exclaimed, and she followed me all around the corral. Clara's eyes met Nate's over her daughter's head, a silent thank you passing between them. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Now it's time for your lessons with Reverend Parker. Go wash up and I'll take you into town. As Tori ran toward the house, Clara set down her basket and approached Nate. You're good with her, she said quietly. Not many men would have the patience. She makes it easy, Nate replied, busying himself with coiling the lead rope. Smart kid, asks a lot of questions. Too many sometimes, Clara agreed with a small smile. She's been that way since she could talk. James used to say her curiosity would either make her a brilliant doctor or get her into terrible trouble. The mention of her late husband created a moment of shared understanding between them, the knowledge of what it meant to lose someone who was the center of your world. Nate looked away, first uncomfortable with the connection. I should get back to the fence, he said, gesturing to the half-completed repair. Clara nodded, respecting his retreat. Of course, we'll be back from town by noon. There's coffee on the stove if you want it. As she walked away, Nate found himself watching her, the straight line of her back, the practical grace of her movements. Clara Watson was not a conventionally beautiful woman, but there was something compelling about her, a quiet strength that he found himself admiring despite his best intentions. He turned back to the fence with renewed determination, focusing on the physical task to distract himself from dangerous thoughts. He was here to work to earn his keep until thunder healed. Nothing more. The day passed quickly, filled with the kind of labor Nate had always found satisfying, fixing things that were broken, restoring order to chaos. By the time Clara and Tori returned from town, he had repaired the fence, fixed the pump handle, and started splitting firewood for the approaching winter. They fell into a routine over the next few days. Nate would rise before dawn, tend to the animals, and begin the day's repairs. Clara would prepare breakfast before heading to town with Tori, leaving Nate to work alone until midday. Afternoons were spent with all three working together on the farm, Clara in her herb garden or laboratory, Tori helping where she could, or working with Penny and Nate tackling the seemingly endless list of repairs that 3 years of minimal maintenance had created. Evenings brought them together around the table for supper, followed by quiet hours before the fire. Clara would often work on mending or read medical texts while Tori practiced her letters, or listened to Nate's occasional stories about places he'd seen in his travels. He was careful to keep these tales impersonal, focusing on landscapes and natural wonders rather than his own experiences. It was a peaceful existence, the kind Nate had convinced himself he neither wanted nor deserved. Yet with each passing day, he found himself settling into it with alarming ease. On the fifth night, as Nate sat on the porch after Tori had gone to bed, Clara joined him carrying 2 cups of what smelled like herbal tea. It's willow bark with honey, she explained, offering him one. Good for aches and pains. I noticed you favoring your left shoulder today. Nate accepted the cup with surprise. He had indeed been feeling the old bullet wound that sometimes troubled him in cold weather, but he thought he'd hidden it well. You're observant, he commented, taking a cautious sip. The tea was bitter despite the honey, but not unpleasant. I was a nurse for 4 years, she replied, settling into the chair beside him. Noticing how people hold themselves where they hurt, what they try to hide, it becomes second nature. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The night was clear and cold, the kind that made the stars seem close enough to touch. Tori's been asking about you, Clara said finally, her voice carefully neutral. She wants to know if you had a family before. Nate stiffened, his fingers tightening around the warm cup. What did you tell her? That if you wanted to share that information, you would do so in your own time. Clara turned to look at him directly. I don't pry into my guest's past, Mr. Reeves. Everyone has things they'd rather not discuss. Nate nodded, grateful for her discretion. Thank you. Another silence stretched between them, this one more charged than the last. Nate could feel Clara wanting to say more, weighing her words carefully. May I ask one thing, though, she said finally. He braced himself. You can ask, were you planning to fix that old windmill tomorrow? Or should I hire Mr. Abernathy to do it? The unexpected question startled a laugh out of him, the first genuine laugh he could remember in years. The windmill, I said I was going to tackle it tomorrow, unless you'd prefer Mr. Abernathy's expertise. Clara smiled a real smile that transformed her serious face. Mr. Abernathy is 70 years old and half blind. I'd rather take my chances with you. She stood collecting his empty cup. Good night, Mr. Reeves. Good night, Mrs. Watson. As she turned to go, he added impulsively, Nate, my name is Nate. She paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Good night, Nate, she said softly, and then she was gone, leaving him alone with the stars and the strange warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the tea. It was dangerous, this warmth. It made him want things he'd sworn never to want again. Connection, belonging, a place in someone's life. He had learned the hard way how quickly such things could be snatched away, leaving nothing but ashes and grief. Yet as he sat there in the quiet darkness, Nate couldn't help but remember Eleanor's final words to him, "Find happiness after me." Was this what she had meant? This tentative reaching toward human connection after years of deliberate isolation? The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Like standing at the edge of a precipice knowing that stepping forward meant either flight or falling. For now, though, he would focus on what was real and immediate, the windmill that needed fixing the barn roof, that needed patching the 1,000 practical tasks that gave structure to his days. The rest could wait, or so he told himself, even as he fell asleep that night, with the memory of Clara's smile following him into dreams that for once held no ghosts. The calm routine of the Watson farm was shattered the next day by the arrival of Ezra Blackwood. Nate was up on a ladder examining the windmill's damaged vane when he heard the approaching hoofbeats. A sleek black horse pulled a polished buggy into the yard, driven by a man whose expensive coat and gold watch chain marked him as someone of means. Clara emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron, her posture stiffening visibly at the sight of her visitor. Tori appeared in the doorway behind her, but didn't come out, a telling reaction that put Nate instantly on alert. He descended the ladder, slowly positioning himself within earshot, but remaining by the windmill, sensing that his presence might not be welcome in what appeared to be a private conversation. Mrs. Watson, the man's voice carried clearly in the still air, formal and precise. You're looking well. Country life agrees with you. Mr. Blackwood, Clara replied coolly, this is an unexpected visit. What brings you all the way out here? Ezra Blackwood removed his hat, revealing thinning brown hair, meticulously arranged to hide its retreat. He was perhaps 50, with the soft hands and slight paunch of the man who did his labor from behind a desk. Business, I'm afraid, he said, his tone conveying regret that didn't reach his eyes. There's a matter concerning your mortgage that requires immediate attention. Clara's back straightened even more if that were possible. I've made every payment on time, Mr. Blackwood. There should be no issues with my mortgage. Blackwood sighed theatrically. It's not the payments, my dear Mrs. Watson. It's the condition of the property. He gestured around the farm. According to the terms of your agreement, the property must be properly maintained by a male head of household. I've been lenient these past years out of respect for your loss, but I'm afraid my partners at the bank are insisting I enforce the clause. The cold calculation behind the man's words made Nate's jaw tighten. He'd encountered men like Blackwood during the war, those who used rules and regulations to mask their own predatory nature. I see, Clara said, her voice steady despite the obvious shock. And what exactly does enforcing the clause entail? Blackwood smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. You have 30 days to either secure a male head of household through marriage or legal appointment, or repay the mortgage in full. The amount currently stands at $800. Nate heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. $800 was a fortune on the frontier, more than most families saw in years. That's impossible, she said, her composure slipping slightly. You know I don't have that kind of money. Yes, well, there is another option. Blackwood stepped closer, lowering his voice, though not enough to prevent Nate from hearing. My offer of marriage still stands, Clara. As my wife, you would want for nothing. The apothecary could remain yours to manage, and young Victoria would have every advantage. Clara took a deliberate step backward. Thank you, but no. I've given you my answer on that matter several times. Blackwood's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing back into professional detachment. As you wish, but the 30-day deadline stands. Either find a husband, repay the mortgage, or prepare to vacate the property. He turned to leave, then paused as he noticed Nate for the first time. And who might this be? He asked, eyes narrowing. Before Clara could respond, Nate approached, deliberately wiping his hands on a rag to emphasize his working-class status. Nathaniel Reeves, he said with a nod, just helping Mrs. Watson with some repairs. Is that so? Blackwood's gaze moved between them, calculating. Well, Mrs. Watson certainly needs all the help she can get, though I doubt a few repairs will satisfy the terms of the mortgage. With that parting shot, he climbed back into his buggy and drove away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Clara remained standing in the yard long after the buggy had disappeared, her face pale but composed. Nate approached cautiously, unsure of his place in this crisis. Mrs. Watson, he began. Clara, she interrupted, turning to face him. If you're going to be part of this mess, you might as well use my name. Clara, he amended. I couldn't help overhearing. $800 is an impossible sum, she finished in for him. Yes, I'm aware. She glanced toward the house where Tori still stood in the doorway watching with worried eyes. Tori, sweetheart, would you check on Buttercup and Penny, make sure they have fresh water? The girl nodded clearly, understanding she was being sent away so the adults could talk privately. As she passed Nate, she looked up at him with solemn eyes. Are we going to lose our home, Mr. Reeves? The direct question asked with such simple trust that he would have an answer hit Nate like a physical blow. I don't know, Tori, he answered honestly, but your mother is very resourceful. If anyone can find a solution, she can. Tori seemed to accept this, continuing toward the barn with the resilience of a child who had already weathered significant storms in her young life. When she was out of earshot, Clara sank onto the porch steps, the composed facade crumbling slightly. I knew this was coming, she admitted. Just not so soon. I thought I had more time. Nate sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Is there any way to raise the money? Sell something, borrow from someone else? She shook her head. Everything of value James and I owned is tied up in this land and the apothecary. And no one in town has that kind of money to lend, except perhaps Mayor Hayes, who is already overextended from helping others Blackwood has targeted. And marriage? Nate asked, carefully aware he was treading on personal ground. Clara looked at him sharply. I married once for love, Mr. Reeves. Nate. I won't marry for convenience, not even to save this place. Her gaze softened as it moved over the farm. Though losing it would break my heart. James loved this land. He had such plans for it for us. The pain in her voice resonated with Nate's own buried grief. He knew what it was to lose not just the present, but all the imagined futures that died with a loved one. What will you do? He asked quietly. Clara straightened her shoulders, the momentary vulnerability replaced by determination. What I've always done, fight with every resource I have. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Starting with completing my research. James was working on a treatment for inflammatory fever that could be revolutionary. If I can finish it and get it to the medical college in Denver, she trailed off, but Nate understood. Success would mean recognition, possibly financial reward, but it was a long shot dependent on too many factors outside her control. In the meantime, she continued, her practical nature reasserting itself. We continue as we are. The farm needs to be in the best possible condition, whether I keep it or am forced to sell. Nate nodded, respecting her resilience. I'll finish the windmill today and start on the barn roof tomorrow. Thank you. Clara's voice softened. I'm sorry you've been drawn into our troubles. This isn't what you signed on for when you agreed to stay until your horse healed. I signed on to work in exchange for room and board, Nate replied simply. That arrangement hasn't changed. But it had changed in ways he wasn't ready to acknowledge. In just a few days, Clara and Tori Watson had ceased to be strangers he was helping out of necessity. They had become something else, something that made their troubles matter to him in a way he'd sworn never to allow again. As Clara returned to the house and Nate climbed back up the ladder to the windmill, he found himself thinking not of his planned departure in less than 2 weeks, but of the 30-day deadline Blackwood had imposed. And for the first time in years, he found himself caring deeply about what happened to someone other than himself. It was dangerous, this caring. It opened doors he'd kept firmly locked since Eleanor and Jacob died. But as he worked through the afternoon fixing the machinery that would draw water for the Watson farm, Nate couldn't deny the growing certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. As dusk fell that evening, Nate sat on the porch steps whittling a small piece of pine wood into the shape of a horse. It was a habit he'd developed during the war, a way to keep his hands busy and his mind focused during the long hours of waiting that punctuated the brief periods of intense action. Over the years, he'd carved hundreds of such figures, leaving them behind in towns and camps. Across the West, small markers of his passing that harmed no one and occasionally brought joy to a child who discovered them. This one, he admitted to himself, was specifically for Tori. The look on her face when Blackwood had left, that mixture of fear and resignation too mature for her years, had stayed with him throughout the day. Children shouldn't have to worry about losing their homes, about their mothers facing impossible choices. The door opened behind him and Clara emerged carrying 2 cups. Steam rose from them in the cool evening air. "More willow bark tea?" Nate asked, accepting one of the cups. Clara shook her head. "Coffee this time, with a little something extra." At his raised eyebrows, she smiled slightly. "Medicinal purposes only, of course." The first sip confirmed his suspicion. She'd added whiskey. Good whiskey at that. "Thank you," he said, appreciating both the warmth and the gesture of trust it represented. Clara settled beside him on the steps, her own cup cradled between her hands. She'd changed from her work dress into a simpler house dress, her hair loosened from its usual tight bun into a single braid that hung down her back. The effect was to make her look younger, more vulnerable somehow. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the half-formed carving in his hands. "A horse for Tori," he admitted. Seemed like she could use something to smile about. Clara watched his hands as they worked the wood, her expression thoughtful. "You've done that before. Many times, I'd guess." Nate nodded, not looking up from his work. "Helps me think." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their doctored coffee as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound echoing across the valley. "I need to gather herbs tonight," Clara said suddenly. "Special ones that only grow in the North Meadow. They're most potent when harvested under the full moon." Nate glanced up at the sky where the moon was indeed full, casting a silver light over the landscape. "Is that safe going out alone at night?" Clara smiled, though there was little humor in it. "I've been doing it for years. The meadow is on our property just beyond the ridge." She hesitated, then added, "But I wouldn't mind company if you're offering." The request surprised him. Clara Watson had struck him as fiercely independent, someone who rarely asked for help. That she was doing so now suggested either unusual trust or unusual necessity. "I'll come," he said, simply pocketing his knife and the half-finished carving. "Let me get my coat." 20 minutes later, they were making their way through the moonlit landscape, Clara, leading with confident steps despite the darkness. She carried a small lantern, though she kept it unlit, explaining that their eyes would adjust better to the natural light of the moon. The North Meadow lay in a natural depression beyond the ridge that sheltered the farm, a wide expanse of open ground surrounded by pine trees. In the moonlight, it looked almost ethereal, the tall grass silvered and swaying slightly in the gentle breeze. Clara moved directly to a particular section of the meadow, kneeling to examine plants that to Nate's untrained eye looked like ordinary weeds. She began harvesting carefully, using a small silver knife to cut stems and leaves, placing them in a cloth bag she carried. "What are these herbs for?" Nate asked, standing guard nearby, his eyes scanning the tree line out of long ingrained habit. Clara's hands paused briefly in their work. "They're part of James's research and now mine. A treatment for inflammatory fever." "The same fever that took your father, I'd wager," said a voice from the darkness. Nate spun toward the sound, his hand automatically reaching for the knife at his belt. A figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the meadow, an elderly Native American man wrapped in a blanket against the night chill. Clara rose to her feet, but her posture remained relaxed. "Evening, Joseph," she greeted him. "I didn't expect to see you tonight." "The moon speaks clearly," the old man replied cryptically. "It told me you would be here gathering the sacred plants, and that you would not be alone." His dark eyes studied Nate with unnerving intensity. "This is Nathaniel Reeves," Clara said. "He's staying at the farm for a while, helping with repairs. Nate, this is Joseph Two Rivers. He's Shoshone, a healer. He taught James much of what he knew about local plants and their medicinal properties." Joseph nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "The spirits whisper that you carry many burdens, Nathaniel Reeves, and many ghosts." Nate's jaw tightened. He'd encountered native mystics before and had little patience for what he considered theatrical pronouncements. "Don't we all?" he replied neutrally. The old man's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Indeed, but some burdens can be set down if one has." The old Shoshone healer's words hung in the moonlit meadow. Some burdens can be set down if one has the courage to open his hands. Nate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "I appreciate the advice," he said stiffly, "but I didn't ask for it." Joseph Two Rivers seemed unperturbed by Nate's defensiveness. He turned his attention to Clara, who had resumed harvesting the herbs with practiced hands. "The medicine progresses," he asked, his tone gentler. Clara nodded without looking up. "I'm close, Joseph. James's notes were clear, but some elements of the preparation still elude me." She carefully placed another cutting in her cloth bag. "The balance between the white man's chemistry and the old ways is difficult to achieve." "As it is in all things," Joseph replied philosophically. He moved closer, kneeling beside her to examine the plants. His gnarled fingers, marked with the signs of great age, touched the leaves with surprising delicacy. "You gather too early. The moon must be directly overhead for full potency." Clara glanced up at the sky where the moon had yet to reach its zenith. "You're right, of course. I was anxious tonight." Joseph's penetrating gaze moved between Clara and Nate. "The banker came today, the one with eyes like a snake." It wasn't a question, and Clara didn't treat it as one. "Blackwood, yes, he's calling in the mortgage." The old man nodded as if confirming something he already knew. "The land speaks to those who listen. It has been troubled since the shadow of his buggy fell upon it." He rose to his feet with a grace that belied his years. "I will wait with you until the proper time for gathering." For the next hour, the three of them sat at the edge of the meadow. Joseph told stories of the land before white settlers arrived, tales of great buffalo hunts and tribal migrations, of vision quests and ancient spirits that still dwelled in the mountains. His voice was hypnotic, the cadence rising and falling like the wind through prairie grass. Despite his initial skepticism, Nate found himself drawn into the narratives. They reminded him of stories his grandmother had told, a half-Cherokee woman who had married his grandfather against her family's wishes and never quite lost her connection to her people's ways. When the moon reached its highest point, Joseph nodded to Clara. Together they harvested the remaining herbs she needed, the old man offering quiet guidance on which plants to select and how to cut them to preserve their power. As they prepared to return to the farm, Joseph placed a hand on Nate's shoulder, a gesture both unexpected and strangely comforting. "The path that brought you here was marked with blood and sorrow," he said, his voice low. "But the path forward need not be. Listen to what the silence tells you, Nathaniel Reeves." Before Nate could respond, the old man had melted back into the shadows at the edge of the meadow, leaving no trace of his passing. "Does he always speak in riddles?" Nate asked as they made their way back toward the farm. Clara smiled faintly in the moonlight. "Joseph believes in the power of words to shape reality. He chooses his carefully." She adjusted the bag of herbs on her shoulder. "He rarely offers counsel to outsiders. You should consider it an honor." "Feels more like an intrusion," Nate muttered. Clara stopped walking, turning to face him directly. In the silver light, her features were both softened and sharpened, her eyes dark pools that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "Joseph is a wise man who has seen much suffering," she said quietly, "including his own. His entire family was killed in a military raid when he was young. He alone survived." The implied rebuke made Nate look away. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean any disrespect." Clara's expression softened. "I know you didn't." She resumed, walking her steps sure even in the dim light. "Joseph was the one who found James after the stagecoach robbery. Too late to save him, but in time to hear his final words." Nate could hear the carefully controlled pain in her voice. "What did he say?" "That I should continue his work. That it was more important than either of us." Clara's voice caught slightly. "And that he was sorry for leaving us alone." The simple words carried such weight of grief that Nate felt his own chest tighten in response. He knew too well the crushing guilt of not being there when loved ones needed you most. "It wasn't his fault," he said softly. "Being attacked by robbers, he couldn't have prevented that." "No," Clara agreed. "Just as I imagine whatever you blame yourself for wasn't truly your fault either." The gentle insight struck too close to Nate's carefully guarded pain. "You don't know anything about me or what I've done," he said more harshly than he intended. "No, I don't," Clara acknowledged calmly. "But I recognize the look of someone carrying a burden of guilt that doesn't rightfully belong to them. I saw it in the mirror every day for 2 years after James died." They had reached the crest of the ridge, the farm visible below them, peaceful under the moonlight. Clara paused, turning to face Nate again. "Whatever ghosts you're running from Mr. Reeves, they followed you here," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to stop running and face them instead." With that, she continued down the path toward the house, leaving Nate standing on the ridge, her words echoing in his mind like a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of pristine autumn day that presaged winter's approach. Nate rose before sunrise, as was his habit, and set about his morning chores with methodical efficiency. By the time Clara and Tori emerged from the house, he had already fed the livestock, checked on Thunder's healing hoof, and split enough firewood to last several days. "Good morning," Tori greeted him cheerfully, seemingly recovered from the previous day's worries. "Mama says we don't have to go into town today, so I can help you with the barn roof." Clara appeared behind her daughter, looking somewhat pale but composed. "What Mama actually said was that you could help by keeping your feet firmly on the ground and handing Mr. Reeves the tools he needs." Nate smiled despite himself. "Sounds like a fair division of labor to me. I could use a good assistant." Tori beamed at being taken seriously. "I'll be the best assistant ever. Papa always said I had a good eye for which tool was needed next." The casual mention of her father sent a pang through Nate. The ease with which Tori spoke of him suggested a child who had been encouraged to keep his memory alive rather than to suppress it. So different from how Nate had handled his own grief, walling it away and refusing to speak of those he'd lost. After breakfast, Nate and Tori set to work on the barn roof while Clara disappeared into her laboratory with the herbs gathered the previous night. True to her word, Tori proved to be an excellent assistant, anticipating which nails or tools Nate would need next, and keeping up a stream of cheerful chatter that made the work go faster. "Mr. Abernathy says you were in the Army," she remarked as she handed up another shingle. "Is that true?" Nate's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "Mr. Abernathy talks too much," he replied, neither confirming nor denying. "He says lots of men who fought in the war don't like to talk about it," Tori persisted. "Papa didn't either, except sometimes he'd wake up shouting. Mama said it was because he saw bad things that stayed in his dreams." Nate hammered a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. "Your mama's right about that." Tori seemed to consider this, her young face serious. "Do you have bad dreams too, Mr. Reeves?" The direct question asked with a child's innocent curiosity caught Nate off guard. He found himself answering honestly. "Sometimes. Not as often as I used to." Tori nodded as if this confirmed something important. "Mama has a special tea she makes for bad dreams. It helps Papa's patients when they can't sleep. Maybe she could make some for you." "Maybe," Nate agreed, touched by her concern. "Now hand me that hammer again." "This roof won't fix itself." They worked through the morning, making good progress on the barn roof. Around midday, Clara emerged from her laboratory carrying a tray with sandwiches and lemonade. She looked tired but satisfied, the way Nate remembered feeling after a successful reconnaissance mission, the quiet pride of challenging work well done. "How goes the research?" he asked as they sat in the shade of a large oak tree, enjoying their simple meal. "Promising," Clara replied, her eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "The herbs we gathered last night have properties I hadn't fully appreciated before. Combined with some techniques from James's notes," she trailed off, seeming to remember that Nate might not share her interest in medical details. "Well, I'm making progress. Mama's medicine is going to help lots of people," Tori declared proudly. "It stops the burning fever that killed so many soldiers during the war." Clara gave her daughter a warning glance. "Tori, remember what we discussed about making promises before something is proven." "But Papa's notes said—" "Papa's notes contain theories that still need testing," Clara interrupted gently but firmly. "Science requires proof, not just hope." Nate watched this exchange with interest. Clara clearly encouraged her daughter's intelligence while still teaching her scientific rigor, an unusual approach to a girl's education on the frontier, where most female children were taught only domestic skills. Your father was working on this medicine during the war, he asked, careful to keep his tone casual. Clara nodded, her expression guarded. Yes, he saw too many men die of inflammatory fever in field hospitals, Union and Confederate alike. He believed many of those deaths were preventable with the right treatment. Papa said doctors should heal everyone no matter which side they fought on. Tori added, her small chin lifting with pride. A noble philosophy, Nate commented, thinking of the field surgeons he'd encountered during his service. Some who shared that view and others who decidedly did not. Clara studied him over the rim of her glass. You don't agree, Nate chose his words carefully. War makes philosophers of some men and animals of others. I've seen both. And which were you, Mr. Reeves? The question was asked softly but with an undertone of challenge. Before Nate could respond or evade, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming up the road toward the farm, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual visiting. Clara stood shading her eyes against the midday sun. That's Sheriff Wilson, she said, identifying the lead rider. And Mayor Hayes with him. I don't recognize the third man. Nate rose as well, instinctively stepping slightly in front of Clara and Tori. Something about the visitor's approach triggered old battlefield instincts, a sense of impending confrontation that had saved his life more than once. As the riders drew closer, he could see that the third man was well-dressed in city clothes with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The trio reined in their horses in the yard, and Sheriff Wilson touched the brim of his hat in greeting. Afternoon, Clara, he said, dismounting with a grunt. Wilson was a solid man in his 40s, with a weathered face and the watchful eyes of a career lawman. Sorry to disturb you, but we've got a situation that needs discussing. Mayor Hayes and the stranger dismounted as well, the latter looking around the farm with obvious interest. Sheriff Wilson? Mayor Hayes? Clara acknowledged them with a nod. What brings you out here? Hayes stepped forward, his usual political smoothness somewhat strained. Clara, this is Marshal James Donovan from Denver. He's tracking a group of outlaws that may have passed through our area. The stranger, Marshal Donovan, stepped forward and removed his hat, revealing close-cropped gray hair and a face marked by a long scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed almost colorless in the bright sunlight, swept over them all, lingering on Nate with particular attention. Mrs. Watson, he said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of the Deep South. Thank you for receiving us. I apologize for the intrusion, but this is a matter of some urgency. Clara's expression remained politely neutral, though Nate could sense her tension. Of course, Marshal. How can I help you? Donovan's gaze shifted to Tori, then back to Clara. Perhaps we could speak privately. Tori, Clara said immediately, please go check on Penny and Buttercup. Make sure they have fresh water. The girl looked like she wanted to protest but thought better of it. Yes, Mama. She cast a curious glance at the visitors before heading toward the barn. When she was out of earshot, Clara turned back to the marshal. Now what's this about outlaws? Donovan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he opened to reveal a wanted poster. We're tracking the Harrow gang led by Luther Harrow. They've been moving north from Colorado, hitting small towns along the way. Robberies mostly, but they've killed when confronted. Nate felt a cold weight settle in his stomach at the mention of the name. Luther Harrow, brother of Cole Harrow, the outlaw leader Nate had killed during the war, a man who had sworn vengeance on those responsible for his brother's death. I'm afraid I can't help you, Clara was saying. We haven't had any strangers pass through apart from Mr. Reeves here, who's helping with repairs while his horse recovers from an injury. Donovan's pale eyes shifted to Nate, studying him with the practiced assessments of a man who had spent years evaluating potential threats. And you are, sir? Nathaniel Reeves, Nate replied, keeping his voice even. Just passing through. Something flickered in the marshal's expression, a momentary recognition quickly masked. Reeves, he repeated thoughtfully. That name sounds familiar. Sheriff Wilson cleared his throat. We're checking all the outlying farms, Clara. The Harrow gang has a pattern of using isolated properties as temporary hideouts. They approach claiming to be travelers in need, then take over once they're inside. I see, Clara nodded. Well, as I said, we've had no such visitors. Donovan was still watching Nate, his gaze sharp and evaluating. Mr. Reeves, you wouldn't happen to have served during the war, would you? Under General Sherman, perhaps? The direct question sent a jolt of alarm through Nate. His service under Sherman wasn't common knowledge. It had been in intelligence work, much of it classified even now, years after the war's end. I served, he acknowledged cautiously, as did many men of my generation. Mayor Hayes stepped forward, perhaps sensing the growing tension. Marshal Donovan is concerned because the Harrow Gang has been known to target Union veterans, particularly those who served in certain campaigns. It's personal for Luther Harrow. Donovan added, his eyes never leaving Nate's face. His brother Cole was killed by Union forces during a special operation near the end of the war. Luther blames specific soldiers for his death and has been systematically hunting them down. Nate's mouth went dry. This was the moment he had dreaded for years, the past catching up to him, threatening not just himself but those around him. Clara and Tori, who had done nothing to deserve being drawn into his long-buried war. That's concerning, he managed to say. But I don't see how it affects Mrs. Watson or her daughter. Donovan's thin smile held no warmth. It affects everyone in the area, Mr. Reeves. The Harrow Gang doesn't leave witnesses. He turned back to Clara. Mrs. Watson, I'd advise you to be extremely cautious about any strangers in the coming days. Keep your doors locked and your firearms loaded. I always do, Clara replied, her calm demeanor betrayed only by the slight tightening of her hands in the folds of her skirt. The marshal nodded, seemingly satisfied. We'll be setting up patrols in the area. If you see or hear anything suspicious, fire 3 shots in the air. Someone will come. With that, the 3 men took their leave, mounting their horses and riding back toward town. Nate watched them go, his mind racing with implications and possibilities, none of them good. Clara waited until they were out of sight before turning to Nate, her expression a mixture of concern and something else, something that looked uncomfortably like suspicion. You know something about this, she said. It wasn't a question. Nate hesitated, torn between the habit of secrecy that had kept him alive for years and the growing sense that Clara Watson deserved more from him than evasions. Not here, he said, finally glancing toward the barn where Tori might reappear at any moment. Tonight, after she's asleep. Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Tonight, she agreed, her voice carrying a note of finality that suggested she would accept nothing less than the full truth. As she walked back toward the house, Nate felt the walls he had so carefully constructed around his past beginning to crack. The marshal's arrival had changed everything. If Luther Harrow was truly in the area, and if he learned of Nate's presence at the Watson farm, Nate closed his eyes briefly, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders with familiar heaviness. He had brought danger to Clara and Tori's door, or so unintentionally, but that would matter little if the worst came to pass. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Reeves faced a choice that wasn't about his own survival. And for the first time in years, he found himself caring deeply about the outcome. The remainder of the day passed in strained silence, with both Nate and Clara absorbed in their own thoughts. Tori, sensitive to the changed atmosphere, but not understanding its cause, was unusually subdued during supper, her usual chatter replaced by worried glances between the adults. Is something wrong? She finally asked as Clara cleared the dishes. Did those men bring bad news? Clara exchanged a glance with Nate before answering. Just a warning to be careful, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. Is it about Mr. Blackwood and the mortgage? Tori persisted, too perceptive for her own good. No, Clara assured her. This is something different. Sheriff Wilson is just being cautious because there might be dangerous men in the area. Tori's blue eyes widened. Outlaws like in the stories Reverend Parker reads us. Something like that, Nate said, trying to keep his tone light. But Sheriff Wilson and the marshal will handle it. That's their job. Tori seemed to consider this, her small face serious. Is that why you checked all the doors and windows earlier and brought the rifle in from the barn? Nate hadn't realized she'd noticed these precautions. Just being careful, he said, like your mama said, nothing to worry about. Later, after Clara had put Tori to bed with extra reassurances, she joined Nate on the porch. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead. Under different circumstances, it might have been peaceful. She's finally asleep, Clara said, wrapping a shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the chill. Though I'm not sure how soundly. She picks up on tension like a cat before a storm. Smart kid, Nate commented. Observant. Too observant sometimes. Clara settled into the chair beside him, her expression resolute. Now tell me what you know about the Harrow Gang that had you checking every approach to the farm this afternoon. Nate took a deep breath, weighing his words carefully. What he was about to share he hadn't spoken of to anyone in years, not since the last of his unit had gone their separate ways after the war, each carrying a piece of a secret that had seemed necessary at the time but had haunted them all since. During the war, he began slowly, I served in a special unit under General Sherman, not regular Army intelligence work mostly. Reconnaissance information gathering, occasional, targeted operations. Clara listened silently, her face revealing nothing. Toward the end of the war, we received intelligence about a group of Confederate guerrillas operating behind Union lines led by a man named Cole Harrow. They weren't regular Confederate forces, more like bandits using the war as cover. They'd hit supply wagons, isolated outposts, field hospitals. Nate paused, the memories he'd kept buried for so long rising to the surface with painful clarity. My unit was tasked with finding and eliminating Harrow's group. We tracked them for weeks, finally locating their camp near a small town in Tennessee. The plan was to capture Harrow if possible and disband his men. But something went wrong, Clara said softly, reading between the lines. Nate nodded, his jaw tight. Everything went wrong. We were betrayed. Someone in the town had warned them. They were waiting for us. It was a bloodbath. Half my men were killed in the first minutes. He could still see it, the ambush, in the pre-dawn darkness, the muzzle flashes, the screams of wounded men. The memory was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday instead of 20 years ago. Somehow I made it to Harrow's tent. He was waiting for me, armed with a cavalry saber. We fought. Nate unconsciously touched a scar on his left arm hidden beneath his shirt. It was close, but I killed him. Stabbed him through the heart with his own blade. Clara's expression remained calm, though her eyes reflected compassion rather than judgment. And Luther Harrow was his brother. His younger brother, yes. He wasn't with the group that night. He'd been sent to another town for supplies. When he returned and found his brother dead, Nate shook his head. He swore vengeance on all of us involved in the raid. Started hunting us down one by one after the war. How many were in your unit? Clara asked. 12 originally. After the ambush, only 5 of us made it out alive. Nate's voice grew somber. Now there are only 2. The others have been killed over the years, made to look like accidents or robberies gone wrong, but always with the same signature, a Confederate $50 left with the body. And you've been running ever since, Clara said, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's why you never stay in one place too long. Nate nodded, unable to meet her gaze. After Eleanor and Jacob died, my wife and son, there was nothing keeping me anywhere. It seemed safer to keep moving, not to form attachments that could be used against me. He paused, the guilt he'd carried for years heavy in his voice. I never thought Luther would find me here in Wyoming territory. I never meant to bring this danger to your door. Clara was quiet for a long moment, absorbing everything he'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured. So the marshal was right. Luther Harrow is hunting Union veterans from your unit, but he doesn't know you're here. I don't think so, Nate replied. But yet, but if he's in the area, it's only a matter of time before someone mentions a stranger staying at the Watson farm. This is a small community word, travels fast. Then we need to be prepared, Clara said with a practicality that surprised him. There was no recrimination in her tone, no blame for the danger he had inadvertently brought to her home. Clara, Nate said, leaning forward, his expression grave. You don't understand. Luther Harrow is dangerous not just to me, but to anyone associated with me. You and Tori should leave. Go stay with relatives until this is over. She shook her head firmly. We have nowhere to go. My parents are dead and James's family back east disowned him when he married me. A nurse wasn't good enough for their distinguished medical lineage. Her mouth twisted in a brief, bitter smile. Besides, I won't be driven from my home by fear. Not when we're already fighting to keep it. This isn't about the mortgage anymore, Nate insisted. This is about your lives. Luther Harrow won't hesitate to hurt you or Tori to get to me. Then we'll just have to make sure he doesn't get the chance. Clara's voice held a steely resolve that reminded Nate she had survived a war and widowhood on the frontier. She was no stranger to hardship or danger. We'll increase our precautions, set up watches, prepare for the worst while hoping it never comes. Nate studied her face in the dim light from the kitchen window, seeing the determination there. He had underestimated Clara Watson from the beginning, mistaking her practical nature for emotional distance, her independence for detachment. He would not make that mistake again. I should leave, he said, making one last attempt at the solution that seemed most obvious to him. Draw them away from here. And go where, Clara challenged, alone outnumbered with nowhere to make a stand. That's not a strategy, Nate, that's suicide. The use of his first name, rare from her lips, emphasized the personal nature of her concern. I've survived this long, he countered, though he knew her assessment was accurate. And now you don't have to face it alone. Clara's hand moved to cover his where it rested on the arm of the chair, a brief warm contact that sent an unexpected jolt through him. We'll get through this together. All of us. Nate wanted to argue further to insist that this was his fight, not hers. But there was something in her steady gaze that stopped him, a certainty, a strength that matched his own. And beneath it, something else, something that made his heart beat faster despite the danger surrounding them. Together, then, he agreed finally. But we do this my way. I've dealt with men like Luther Harrow before. Clara nodded, withdrawing her hand. I'm counting on that. Now tell me everything you know about how they operate, what to expect. If we're going to prepare, we need to be thorough. As the night deepened around them, Nate found himself sharing tactical information he hadn't thought about in years. The patterns of guerrilla fighters, the warning signs of an impending attack, the defensive measures that might give them an edge. Clara listened intently, asking smart questions that revealed her own practical intelligence. It was well past midnight when they finally went inside the plans made the initial precautions set. As Clara paused at her bedroom door, she turned to Nate with an expression he couldn't quite read. Thank you, she said softly, for trusting me with the truth. I should have told you sooner, Nate admitted. You had a right to know what I was bringing into your home. Clara shook her head slightly. We all have pasts we'd rather not revisit, Nate. I understand that better than most. She hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I don't believe you're responsible for what happened to your family. War forces impossible choices on good men. The guilt lies with those who continue the violence long after the fighting should be over. Before Nate could respond, she had slipped into her room, closing the door quietly behind her. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Reeves allowed himself to consider the possibility that the burden of guilt he had carried for so long might not be entirely his to bear. It was a dangerous thought, as threatening to his carefully constructed worldview as Luther Harrow's imminent arrival was to their physical safety. But as he checked the doors and windows one final time before retiring to his own room, Nate found himself holding on to Clara's words like a talisman against the darkness that had followed him for so many years. Together, then. Such a simple phrase, but one that changed everything. The next few days passed in a state of heightened vigilance. Nate and Clara established a routine that allowed them to maintain normal activities while keeping watch for any sign of the Harrow gang. They took turns patrolling the perimeter of the farm, especially at night. Nate moved his bedroll to the front room, positioning himself between any potential intruders in the bedrooms where Clara and Tori slept. To Tori, they presented these changes as simple precautions, nothing to be afraid of. But the girl was too perceptive to be entirely fooled. Nate often caught her watching him with solemn eyes that seemed to understand more than a child her age should. Are the bad men coming here? She asked him directly on the third morning, as they checked Thunder's healing hoof together. Nate considered how to answer, unwilling to lie, but equally unwilling to frighten her unnecessarily. We don't know, he said finally, but it's always better to be prepared just in case. Tori nodded, accepting this. Papa used to say that too. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's why he taught Mama to shoot. This casual revelation surprised Nate. He had seen no indication that Clara was comfortable with firearms. Your mama knows how to handle a gun. Oh yes, Tori said with obvious pride. Papa said she's a better shot than most men. She can hit a tin can at 50 paces. Nate filed this information away, another piece in the increasingly complex puzzle that was Clara Watson. The more he learned about her, the more he realized how thoroughly he had misjudged her, at first seeing only the respectable widow running an apothecary, missing the layers of strength and capability beneath. That afternoon, while Tori was napping, a concession to the exhaustion brought on by disturbed sleep and heightened tension, Nate found Clara in her laboratory carefully measuring powders into small paper packets. Medicine? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. She glanced up, offering a tired smile. Yes, Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism is acting up again with the cold weather. This should help ease the pain. Nate watched her work for a moment, struck by the precision of her movements, the quiet confidence with which she handled the various ingredients. Tori tells me you're a crack shot. Clara's hands paused briefly before resuming their task. Tori has an unfortunate tendency to exaggerate, she said, though a hint of color touched her cheeks. James taught me the basics. He believed a woman alone on the frontier should be able to defend herself. A progressive view, Nate commented. James was progressive in many ways, Clara replied, a note of pride in her voice. He believed women were just as capable as men, given the same opportunities. She finished packaging the medicine and wiped her hands on a cloth, which was fortunate since we often worked side by side during the war. You were a battlefield nurse, Nate had guessed as much, but hadn't asked directly. Clara nodded. 4 years with the Union Army following the Western campaigns. That's where I met James. He was a surgeon with the 10th Missouri. Her expression softened at the memory. He was different from the other doctors, treated the nurses as colleagues rather than servants, taught us medical techniques beyond basic care. Said he'd rather have a skilled nurse at his side than an arrogant young doctor fresh from medical college. The picture that emerged was of a remarkable partnership, not just a marriage, but a shared mission. It explained much about Clara's determination to continue her husband's research, her scientific approach to medicine that went well beyond the usual herbal remedies of frontier healers. You must miss him very much, Nate said quietly. Clara met his gaze steadily. Every day. But missing him doesn't mean I've stopped living. James wouldn't have wanted that for me or for Tori. There was something in her expression, a quiet certainty, a peace with her grief that Nate envied. His own loss had consumed him, driving him from place to place in an endless attempt to outrun memories that always followed. Before he could respond, they heard Tori calling from the front of the house, her voice high with excitement. Mama, Mr. Reeves, come quick, Penny's doing tricks. The moment broken, Clara smiled and set aside her work. Duty calls. The greatest medical discovery in the world must await for a performing foal, it seems. As they walked together toward the corral where Tori was working with the young horse, Nate found himself studying Clara's profile, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the strength that seemed to radiate from her despite her slender frame. She was nothing like Eleanor, whose gentle beauty and quiet ways had been his anchor during the war. Clara Watson was fired to Eleanor's water direct, where his wife had been diplomatic, challenging, where she had been soothing. And yet Nate realized with a jolt of surprise he was drawn to her in a way he hadn't been drawn to any woman since Eleanor's death. The revelation was both exhilarating and terrifying. The rest of the day passed in a semblance of normalcy, though the underlying tension never completely dissipated. Nate continued his work on the farm buildings, Clara prepared medicines and tended her garden, and Tori divided her time between lessons and caring for Penny. To an outside observer, they might have appeared to be a typical frontier family going about their daily routine. But as evening approached, bringing with it the heightened vulnerability of darkness, the vigilance returned. Nate checked and rechecked the defenses he had established, positioning lanterns to eliminate blind spots, ensuring weapons were loaded and accessible if needed. Supper was a subdued affair, with even Tori sensing the tension that hung in the air. She picked at her food, unusually quiet, her small face drawn with worry beyond her years. I think I'll read by the fire for a while, Clara announced after the dishes were cleared. Tori, would you like me to read to you before bed? The girl nodded, some of the worry easing from her expression. Can we read Treasure Island again? The part where Jim hides in the apple barrel? Of course, Clara agreed with a smile. Go get ready for bed and I'll be there shortly. As Tori disappeared into her room, Clara turned to Nate. I'll take first watch tonight, she said in a low voice. You've been up since dawn. Nate shook his head. I'm fine. Get some rest with Tori. I'll wake you at midnight for your turn. Clara looked like she might argue, but then nodded, recognizing the practicality of his suggestion. Midnight, then. Don't you dare let me sleep longer. After Clara had gone to read to Tori, Nate made a final circuit of the house and barn, checking locks and scythons. Satisfied that they were as secure as possible, he settled onto the porch rifle across his knees to begin his watch. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the black Wyoming sky. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound echoing across the valley with haunting clarity. It was the kind of night that had always brought Nate a measure of peace during his years of wandering the vastness of the sky, the primal sounds of the wilderness, the sense of being small but free beneath the cosmic expanse. Now, though the darkness held only potential threats, each shadow a possible hiding place, each unusual sound a warning to be heeded. He had been on watch for perhaps 2 hours when he heard it, the faint but unmistakable sound of a horse's snort, quickly muffled. It came from the north side of the property beyond the barn, where the land rose toward the ridge that sheltered the farm from the worst of the winter winds. Nate rose silently, rifle ready, and moved into the deeper shadow beside the porch. Straining his eyes and ears, he waited, every sense alert for further signs of intrusion. There another sound this time, the soft metallic clink of a bridle or bit. Someone was approaching on horseback, moving slowly and trying to remain quiet. One rider, possibly two, coming from the direction opposite the main road. His mind raced through the possibilities. It could be the Harrow gang beginning their reconnaissance before a full assault. It could be Marshal Donovan or Sheriff Wilson making an unannounced patrol, or it could be something entirely innocent, a traveler lost in the dark, a neighbor with an urgent message. Nate weighed his options. If he called out a challenge, he would reveal his position and awareness. If he remained silent, he might gain the advantage of surprise if the visitor proved hostile. But he would also risk allowing a potential threat to get closer to the house to Clara and Tori. Decision made, he moved silently around the side of the house, using the shadows for cover, making his way toward the barn. From there, he would have a clear view of anyone approaching from the north while remaining hidden himself. He had nearly reached the barn when a voice called out softly from the darkness. "Mr. Reeves, are you there?" Nate froze, the voice both familiar and unexpected. It was Joseph Two Rivers, the old Shoshone healer they had met in the moonlit meadow. "Over here," Nate replied quietly, lowering his rifle slightly, but keeping it ready. Trust came hard after years of vigilance. The old man materialized from the shadows, leading a dappled pony. He wore no blanket tonight, despite the cold, dressed instead in traditional buckskin clothing with intricate beadwork that caught the starlight. "You watch well," Joseph commented approval in his weathered voice. "Many would not have heard my approach." "Many haven't spent years expecting trouble," Nate replied dryly. "What brings you here at this hour, Joseph? Is something wrong?" The old man tied his pony to the corral fence before answering. "The spirits are restless tonight. They speak of danger circling this place, men with darkness in their hearts coming soon." Under normal circumstances, Nate might have dismissed such talk as superstition. But recent events had made him less skeptical of warnings regardless of their source. "The Harrow gang," he said. It wasn't a question. Joseph nodded. "They camp in the old mining valley 3 ridges east. 7 men with many weapons. They ask questions in the Indian camps, looking for a man who matches your description." The information sent a chill through Nate that had nothing to do with the night air. Luther Harrow was indeed hunting him, and he was close, much closer than Nate had feared. "How do you know this?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "My nephew's son hunts in those hills. He saw their camp yesterday, listened to their talk from hiding." Joseph's dark eyes reflected the starlight. "They plan to come tomorrow when the sun is highest. They believe you will be working outside, easier to take by surprise." Tomorrow, less than 12 hours away. Nate's mind raced, calculating options, assessing their meager defenses against 7 armed men with nothing to lose. "I need to warn Clara," he said, starting toward the house. Joseph caught his arm, his grip surprisingly strong for his age. "There is more you should know. The banker, the one with snake eyes, he rides with them." "Blackwood?" Nate stared at the old man in disbelief. "Ezra Blackwood is with the Harrow gang." Joseph nodded gravely. "He met with them last night, gave them whiskey and information. He spoke of the woman and child, said they could be used to draw you out." Cold rage flooded through Nate, sharper and more focused than anything he had felt in years. It was one thing for Luther Harrow to hunt him, that was at least understandable if misguided. But for Blackwood to deliberately endanger Clara and Tori for his own purposes. "Thank you for the warning," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We'll be ready for them in them." Joseph studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "The path of vengeance leads only to more graves, Nathaniel Reeves. Remember this when the time comes to choose." With that cryptic advice, the old man untied his pony and melted back into the night, leaving Nate alone with the weight of new knowledge and the urgent need for action. He found Clara in the kitchen, a cup of tea cooling at her elbow as she pored over a medical journal by lamplight. She looked up as he entered, instantly alert to his expression. "What is it?" she asked, closing the book. "What's happened?" Nate related Joseph's warning as concisely as possible, watching Clara's face pale as she absorbed the implications. "Blackwood," she whispered, her voice tight with shock and betrayal. "I knew he was desperate to acquire the property, but this is monstrous." "It makes a certain cold sense," Nate said grimly. "If the Harrow gang kills me, and possibly you and Tori as well, it would be written off as another tragic outlaw attack. The property would revert to the bank with no one to contest Blackwood's claim." Clara's hands clenched into fists on the table. Using outlaws to do his dirty work while maintaining his respectable facade. The coward. "The question now is what we do about it," Nate said, taking the seat opposite her. "Joseph says they are coming tomorrow at midday. 7 men, well armed." Clara's expression shifted from shock to resolute determination. "We could try to reach town, get help from Sheriff Wilson." Nate shook his head. "Too risky. If Harrow's men are watching the farm, they'd intercept us on the open road. We'd be easy targets." "We can't just wait here to be attacked," Clara protested. "No," Nate agreed. "We prepare and we use the one advantage we have. We know they're coming and when. They expect to surprise us. Instead, we'll surprise them." He outlined his plan quickly, a defensive strategy that maximized their limited resources while minimizing risk to Clara and Tori. Clara listened intently, asking pointed questions that revealed both her intelligence and her determination to protect her daughter at all costs. "It could work," she acknowledged when he had finished. "But it's dangerous, Nate. These men are killers." "So was I once," he replied quietly. "In the war and after when necessary. I haven't forgotten how." Clara reached across the table to take his hand, her touch warm and steady. "I'm not questioning your abilities. I'm concerned about the odds. 7 against 1. 2, Nate corrected her. "You said yourself you're a good shot." "Against targets, yes, not against men trying to kill me." Despite her words, there was no fear in Clara's voice, only the practical assessment of someone evaluating a challenging situation. "With luck, it won't come to that." Nate squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "The best outcome is that we convince them the risk isn't worth the reward." Clara nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "And if that fails, then we do whatever is necessary to protect Tori," Nate said simply. "Everything else is secondary." On this, at least, they were in complete agreement. They spent the next hour preparing, checking weapons, securing the house, planning escape routes if the worst should happen. Clara revealed a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards in Tori's room, large enough to conceal the child if necessary. "James built it when we first came here," she explained as she showed Nate the cleverly disguised trapdoor. "The frontier wasn't as settled then, and Indian raids were still a concern. We've never had to use it, thankfully." "Let's hope that remains true," Nate said, impressed despite himself by the doctor's foresight. By the time they had finished their preparations, it was well past midnight. Clara insisted that Nate get some rest while she took watch, and this time he didn't argue. They would both need to be alert for what was coming. As he settled onto his bedroll in the front room, Nate found his thoughts turning not to the danger ahead, but to Clara herself, her courage, her resilience, her unwavering dedication to her daughter, and her late husband's work. In just over a week, she had become more important to him than anyone had been in 12 long years of solitude. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Tomorrow he would fight not just for his own survival, as he had for years, but for hers and Tori's as well. The stakes had never been higher. With that sobering thought, Nathaniel Reeves closed his eyes and fell into the light, vigilant sleep of a soldier before battle. His last conscious thought, a silent promise to Eleanor Jacob and the 2 people who had somehow breached the walls around his heart. "I will not fail this time, no matter what it costs me." Dawn brought a deceptive tranquility to the Watson farm. The sky was clear, the air crisp with the promise of another fine autumn day. Birds sang in the cottonwood trees, and a gentle breeze rustled the dry grass of the nearby meadow. Nature, it seemed, was indifferent to the human drama about to unfold. Nate rose before first light, checking their defenses one final time, before waking Clara, who had maintained her watch through the night. Together, they prepared a simple breakfast, their movements quiet and efficient, like soldiers before battle. The most difficult part came when Tori joined them, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her small face immediately registering the unusual tension in the kitchen. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking from her mother to Nate. "Is it the bad men? Are they coming today?" Clara knelt before her daughter, taking her small hands. "Tori, I need you to listen very carefully. Yes, there may be trouble today. Mr. Reeves and I have a plan, but I need you to be brave and do exactly as we tell you. Can you do that?" The girl nodded solemnly, her blue eyes wide but steady. "Like when Papa was treating sick people during the fever outbreak, when we had to be very quiet and follow all the rules." "Exactly like that," Clara confirmed, smoothing Tori's hair. "Only this time the most important rule is that you stay hidden no matter what you hear until either Mr. Reeves or I come for you. Not Sheriff Wilson, not Mayor Hayes, not anyone else, just us." "Even if someone calls my name," Tori asked, understanding the gravity of the situation with a maturity beyond her years. "Even then," Nate said, joining them. "It's like a game of hide and seek where staying hidden is the most important thing in the world." Tori turned her solemn gaze to him. "Are you going to fight the bad men, Mr. Reeves?" Nate hesitated, unwilling to lie, but equally unwilling to frighten her more than necessary. "I'm going to try to make them go away without fighting. But if I have to fight to keep you and your mama safe, then yes, I will." The child considered this, then reached out to touch his hand. "Papa said sometimes fighting is necessary when people you love are in danger." He didn't like it, but he understood. The simple statement, delivered with such innocent conviction, struck Nate to the core. People you love. The words echoed in his mind a truth he had been avoiding acknowledging fully. "Your papa was a wise man," he managed to say, his voice rougher than usual. "Now let's have breakfast. We need to keep up our strength for the day ahead." They ate quickly, the meal punctuated by practical instructions and reassurances. After breakfast, Clara helped Tori pack a small bag with a book, a doll, and a canteen of water to be kept in her hiding place beneath the floorboards. "Remember," Clara told her, "not a sound no matter what you hear. This is the most important hide-and-seek game you'll ever play." "I understand, Mama," Tori replied, her small face solemn. "I'll be as quiet as a mouse in the walls." While Clara prepared, Nate made his final rounds of the property, setting up the defensive positions they had planned the night before. By mid-morning, everything was in place. All that remained was to wait for the Harrow gang to make their move. Around 11, with the sun climbing toward its zenith, Clara joined Nate on the porch. She had changed from her usual dress into more practical clothing, trousers that must have belonged to her late husband, tucked into sturdy boots, and a man's shirt that she had modified to fit her slender frame. Her hair was braided and pinned tightly to her head, and a leather belt around her waist held a holstered revolver. Nate raised an eyebrow at the transformation. "You look scandalous," Clara suggested with a hint of her usual dry humor. "Prepared," Nate corrected. "It suits you." A touch of color rose in her cheeks at the compliment. "James always said conventional attire was useless in an emergency. I kept these clothes for treating patients in difficult conditions, climbing down mine shafts, riding to remote homesteads in the dead of winter." "Where's Tori?" Nate asked, noting the girl's absence. "Already in her hiding place. I gave her a mild sedative in her milk, just enough to keep her calm and quiet for a few hours." Clara's expression was a mixture of determination and maternal worry. "I hope I'm doing the right thing." "You are," Nate assured her. "The safest place for her is exactly where she is, and the calmer she remains, the safer she'll be." Clara nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. "So now we wait." "Now we make it look like we're not waiting," Nate corrected. "Luther Harrow is many things, but stupid isn't one of them. If he sees us just sitting here, he'll know something's wrong." Following their plan, Clara returned to her herb garden, ostensibly harvesting late-season plants, while Nate began working on the windmill again, positioning himself where he had a clear view of all approaches to the farm. The morning stretched on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the tension mounting with each passing minute. By noon, Nate's shoulders ached with the strain of appearing relaxed while remaining hypervigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the first sign of approach. It came not from the direction they had expected, the North Ridge, where Joseph had reported the gang's camp, but from the main road to town. A cloud of dust rising in the distance signaled riders approaching at a steady pace. "Clara," Nate called, keeping his voice casual though his pulse had quickened. "Riders coming?" She straightened from her garden, shading her eyes against the midday sun. Her hand dropped casually to the revolver at her hip, confirming she was ready. As the riders drew closer, Nate counted 5 men fewer than the 7 Joseph had reported, which meant at least 2 others might be approaching from a different direction. A standard flanking maneuver, one he had used himself during the war. He descended from the windmill with deliberate, unhurried movements, positioning himself near the water trough, where his rifle leaned against the corral fence, appearing casual but within easy reach. The riders entered the yard in a loose formation, spreading out slightly as they approached another tactical move that confirmed these were no ordinary visitors. Their leader, a tall man with graying hair and a face deeply lined by sun and hardship, reined in his horse directly in front of Nate. Luther Harrow had aged in the 20 years since Nate had last seen him, but there was no mistaking the cold determination in his pale blue eyes. Eyes so like his brother's that for a moment Nate felt a disorienting sense of déjà vu, as if he were back in that tent in Tennessee facing Cole Harrow's blade. "Afternoon," Nate said calmly, not acknowledging any recognition. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Luther's gaze swept over him, assessing, calculating. "You can, as a matter of fact," he replied, his voice carrying the same soft southern drawl Nate remembered. "We're looking for someone. A man named Nathaniel Reeves, Union Army intelligence during the war, served under Sherman. Been told he might be in these parts." Nate maintained his neutral expression with effort. "Name's familiar," he said, neither confirming nor denying. "What's your business with him?" A cold smile touched Luther's lips. "Unfinished business from the war. Nothing that need concern you unless you are hiding something or someone." Clara had moved closer during this exchange, positioning herself by the porch steps, her posture relaxed but alert. "Gentlemen," she called, her voice steady, "if you're looking for someone, perhaps Sheriff Wilson in town could help. My farmhand and I are just trying to get our work done before the weather turns." Luther's attention shifted to Clara, his gaze sharpening as he noted her unusual attire and the revolver at her hip. "Mrs. Watson, I presume Ezra Blackwood sends his regards." The casual mention of Blackwood's name, confirming Joseph's warning about their alliance, sent a flash of anger through Nate. He took a deliberate step forward, drawing Luther's attention back to himself. "I think you should move on," he said, his voice hardening. "The ladies made it clear you are not welcome here." Luther studied him more closely, a spark of recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. "You know, you look mighty familiar," he said slowly. Almost like he stopped, a realization spreading across his features. "Well, I'll be damned. Nathan Reeves himself playing farmhand to a pretty widow. The years haven't been kind to you, Captain." "Kind enough," Nate replied, dropping all pretense. "I know why you're here, Luther. It won't bring Cole back." "No, it won't," Luther agreed, his expression hardening. "But it'll settle a debt that's been owed for 20 years. Cole's death deserves justice." "Your brother was a war criminal," Nate said flatly. "He led raids on field hospitals, killed unarmed medical personnel, stole supplies meant for wounded men, Union and Confederate alike." Luther's face flushed with anger. Lies. Cole was a patriot fighting for the Southern cause when others had given up. The war was over, Luther. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox weeks before. Cole was using the confusion to line his own pockets. Nothing more. Nate kept his voice calm, trying to reach whatever rationality might remain in the man. "I was there. I saw what he'd done." For a moment, doubt flickered in Luther's eyes, a brief hesitation that suggested part of him had always suspected the truth about his brother. But the doubt was quickly replaced by renewed determination. "Enough talk," he said coldly. "I've waited 20 years for this moment. Time to finish what Cole started." As if on cue, 2 more riders emerged from behind the barn, the flanking force Nate had anticipated. They had circled around while Luther kept him distracted with conversation, a classic military tactic. "Mrs. Watson," Luther called, not taking his eyes off Nate. "I have no quarrel with you or your daughter. Stand aside and you won't be harmed." Clara's voice was steady when she replied, "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Harrow. This is my property and Mr. Reeves is under my protection." Luther's expression hardened. "Have it your way." He turned slightly in his saddle, addressing his men. "Boy, Reeves alive, if possible. I want him to suffer like Cole did. The woman is expendable." What happened next unfolded with the chaotic speed of all true violence. As Luther's men moved to dismount, Nate dove for his rifle by the corral fence. Clara, with reflexes that confirmed she was indeed the crack shot Tori had described, drew her revolver and fired at the nearest flanker, the bullet striking his shoulder and spinning him from his horse. The yard erupted in gunfire. Nate rolled behind the water trough for cover, returning fire with methodical precision. One of Luther's men fell clutching his chest. Another took a bullet in the leg from Clara, who had positioned herself in the sheltered corner of the porch. Luther himself had dismounted and taken cover behind the well-returning fire with a cavalry revolver. His remaining men spread out using the barn and corral for cover as they attempted to circle around Nate and Clara's positions. "You're outnumbered, Reeves," Luther shouted over the gunfire. "Surrender now, and the woman lives." "Don't believe him, Nate," Clara called from her position. "He can't leave witnesses." She was right, of course. Once Luther had his revenge, he would eliminate anyone who could identify him and his gang. Clara and Tori were as much targets as Nate himself. The firefight continued, a deadly dance of advance and retreat, shot and countershot. Nate and Clara had the advantage of prepared positions and intimate knowledge of the terrain, but Luther's men had the edge in numbers and firepower. Slowly, methodically, they were being pushed back toward the house. If they were forced on, they would be trapped, and Tori's hiding place would be at risk of discovery. Nate made a split-second decision. "Clara," he called, "cover me." Before she could protest, he broke from his position, firing rapidly to keep Luther's men pinned down as he made a dash for the barn. It was a calculated risk, drawing fire away from the house and Clara while positioning himself to flank Luther's position by the well. Clara understood his strategy immediately. She laid down a barrage of covering fire, forcing Luther and his men to keep their heads down as Nate sprinted across the open yard. A bullet clipped his arm as he ran, sending a searing pain through his shoulder, but adrenaline carried him forward. He reached the barn and ducked inside, using the shadows to conceal his movements as he worked his way to the far side where a window would give him a clear shot at Luther's position. Outside, the gunfire had momentarily ceased, a tense silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the nervous whinnying of horses frightened by the noise. "Reeves," Luther's voice carried clearly in the stillness. "I've got your woman. Come out now or she dies." Nate's blood ran cold. From his position in the barn, he couldn't see the porch where Clara had been. Had Luther's men managed to capture her while he was repositioning? Cautiously, he peered through a crack in the barn wall. What he saw made his heart stutter in his chest. Luther stood in the open yard, his arm around Clara's neck, a pistol pressed to her temple. Her revolver lay in the dust at their feet, and blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, evidence that she hadn't been taken without a fight. 10 seconds, Reeve," Luther called. "Then I start shooting pieces off her one by one." Nate weighed his options with the cold calculation of a combat veteran. He had a clear shot at Luther from his position, but at this distance, with Clara as a shield, it was risky. If he missed, or if his bullet passed through Luther and hit Clara. 5 seconds. "I'm coming out," Nate called, making his decision. "Don't harm her." He set down his rifle and stepped out of the barn, hands raised to shoulder height, moving slowly into the open yard. Luther's remaining men, 3 still on their feet, plus the 2 wounded, kept their weapons trained on him as he approached. "That's far enough," Luther commanded, when Nate was about 20 feet away. "On your knees, hands behind your head." Nate complied, his mind racing for a way out of this trap. His eyes met Clara's over Luther's shoulder. Despite the fear evident in her face, she gave him a slight nod, a signal that she was ready for whatever plan he might have. "You've got me, Luther," Nate said calmly. "Let her go. This is between you and me." Luther laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, Captain Reeves, I've learned a few things about psychological warfare over the years. Killing you would be too quick, too merciful. I want you to suffer like I've suffered to lose someone you care about right before your eyes." He pressed the pistol harder against Clara's temple, making her wince. "Just like you took Cole from me, I'm going to take her from you. Then when you've felt that pain, then I'll kill you too." "Luther," Nate said, keeping his voice level despite the fear clawing at his throat. "Think about what you're doing. Murder a woman in cold blood. Is that who you are now? Is that who Cole would want you to be?" Something flickered in Luther's eyes, a momentary doubt, a hesitation. "Cole was a good man," he said, but there was less certainty in his voice. "Maybe he was once," Nate agreed, sensing the opening. "Before the war changed him like it changed all of us. But the man I encountered that night in Tennessee, he wasn't a patriot or a soldier anymore. He was just a killer." Shut up, Luther snarled, his arm tightening around Clara's throat. You don't know anything about him. I know he died with 3 field surgeons' watches in his pocket, Nate continued relentlessly. I know we found medical supplies in his tent that had been stolen from a field hospital where 12 wounded men died because they lacked those same supplies. I know he had a ledger recording the sale of stolen morphine to civilian dealers. Each detail struck Luther like a physical blow, his expression shifting from rage to uncertainty to a dawning, horrified realization. No, he whispered. That's not. Cole wouldn't. The war corrupted many good men, Luther. Nate said, his voice gentler now. Confederate and Union alike. Your brother was one of them, but his crimes aren't yours to answer for. Not unless you make them yours by your own actions here today. Luther's arm had loosened slightly around Clara's neck as doubt continued to work on him. It was the opening she had been waiting for. With a swift, practiced movement, the kind that came from wartime experience Nate hadn't fully appreciated until now, Clara drove her elbow hard into Luther's ribs while simultaneously stomping down on his instep. The double blow caused Luther to loosen his grip and stagger backward. Clara twisted free, dropping to the ground and rolling away from him. Nate was moving the instant Clara made her move. He lunged forward, tackling Luther before the man could recover his balance. They went down hard, the pistol flying from Luther's hand as they grappled in the dust. Luther was strong desperation and 20 years of hatred, lending him strength beyond his years. But Nate had the advantage of recent combat experience and the cold determination of a man fighting for more than just himself. They rolled across the yard, trading blows, each seeking the advantage. Luther's men held their fire, unable to get a clear shot at Nate without risking their leader. Finally, Nate managed to pin Luther beneath him, one arm across the man's throat, the other pulled back for a decisive blow. Luther glared up at him, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, his expression a mixture of hatred and defeat. Do it, he spat. Finish what you started 20 years ago. Kill me like you killed Cole. Nate held his position for a long moment, the rage of battle singing in his veins, the accumulated grief and guilt of 20 years demanding release. It would be so easy to end it here, one final blow to silence the ghosts of the past forever. But as he looked into Luther's eyes, he saw not just his enemy, but a mirror of his own pain, a man who had let grief consume him, who had built his entire existence around a quest for vengeance that had ultimately hollowed him out from within. No, Nate said, finally relaxing his raised fist. Enough men have died because of this war. It ends here today. He rose, pulling Luther to his feet with him. The older man stood swaying slightly, the fight gone out of him, looking suddenly aged and diminished. Your men will drop their weapons, Nate called to the remaining Zhang members, or I'll let Mrs. Watson shoot you where you stand. Clara had retrieved her revolver and stood with it trained steadily on Luther's men, her expression leaving no doubt that she would follow through on Nate's threat if necessary. One by one, Luther's men laid down their weapons, the fight gone out of them with their leader's defeat. The battle was over. As if on cue, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road. Sheriff Wilson appeared leading a posse of townsmen, including Mayor Hayes and Reverend Parker. With them, to Nate's surprise, was Marshal Donovan. Looks like we missed the excitement, Sheriff Wilson commented dryly as they rode into the yard, taking in the scene of surrender and the wounded men being tended by Clara. Your timing could have been better, Nate agreed, not bothering to hide his irritation. How did you know to come? Joseph Two Rivers, Reverend Parker explained, dismounting. He came to the church this morning, said you might need help against men with darkness in their hearts. We gathered as many as we could. Marshal Donovan approached, his pale eyes moving from Nate to Luther Harrow with professional interest. Captain Reeves, I presume I thought I recognized you in town. He nodded toward Luther. And Luther Harrow, I've been tracking your gang for months. You knew who I was? Nate asked, surprised. Donovan nodded. Your reputation in certain circles precedes you. Your work during the war saved many lives, including my brother's at Chattanooga. He extended his hand. It's an honor to finally meet you, sir. Nate accepted the handshake automatically, still processing this unexpected turn of events. And you waited until now to mention this because... Wasn't sure how much you wanted revealed, Donovan replied with a slight shrug. Many men from intelligence work prefer to leave those days behind them. And I wasn't entirely certain Luther was in the area until yesterday. As Sheriff Wilson and his men began securing the prisoners and tending to the wounded, Clara approached Nate, her face pale but composed despite the blood drying on her forehead. "Tori," she said quietly, "I need to check on her." Together they hurried into the house, leaving the aftermath of the battle to the lawmen outside. Tori's hiding place was undisturbed, the trapdoor still concealed beneath the braided rug in her room. When they opened it, they found the girl curled up with her doll, drowsy from the mild sedative but otherwise unharmed. "Mama," she murmured as Clara gathered her into her arms. "Is it over? Are the bad men gone?" "Yes, sweetheart," Clara assured her, holding her close. "The bad men are gone. Sheriff Wilson is taking them away right now. We're safe." Tori's sleepy gaze moved to Nate standing in the doorway. "Did you have to fight them, Mr. Reeves?" Nate nodded, unable to lie to those trusting blue eyes. "I did, but no one was badly hurt, and the bad men won't be coming back." "Good," Tori said with the simple certainty of childhood. "I knew you would protect us, like Papa would have." The innocent comparison sent a wave of emotion through Nate, pride, humility, and a deep aching tenderness that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. He had protected them, yes, but they had also protected him, not just physically in the firefight, but emotionally, drawing him back from the brink of a solitude so complete it had nearly erased the man he once was. As Clara cradled Tori in her arms, murmuring reassurances, Nate stepped back into the hallway. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving in its wake a bone-deep weariness and the sharp sting of his bullet-grazed arm. Through the front window, he watched Sheriff Wilson and his men securing Luther Harrow and the surviving members of his gang. The threat that had haunted him for 20 years had finally been confronted and defeated. Not through violence or vengeance, but through truth, the truth about Cole Harrow that had finally penetrated his brother's decades-long crusade for revenge. "Mr. Reeves," Tori's small voice drew him from his thoughts. She stood in the bedroom doorway, Clara behind her with a supportive hand on her shoulder. "You're bleeding." Nate glanced down at his arm where blood had soaked through his shirt sleeve. "It's just a scratch," he assured her with a genuine smile. "Nothing your mama can't fix." "Mama can fix anything," Tori agreed with absolute certainty. "She fixed Buttercup's leg when she cut it on the fence, and that was much worse than your arm." Clara's eyes met Nate's over her daughter's head, a silent message passing between them. Gratitude, relief, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. As Clara cleaned and bandaged Nate's arm with Tori's solemn assistance, Sheriff Wilson entered, removing his hat as he stepped through the door. "Mrs. Watson, Mr. Reeves," he greeted them with a respectful nod. "The prisoners are secured. Marshal Donovan will be taking Luther Harrow and his men to Denver for trial." He hesitated, glancing at Tori. "There's a matter we need to discuss when it's convenient." Clara nodded. "Tori, would you please go check on Penny? She must be frightened after all the noise." When Tori had gone, Sheriff Wilson removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Ezra Blackwood is missing," he said without preamble. "He wasn't at the bank this morning, and his housekeeper says he didn't come home last night." Clara's hands stilled. "After what we learned about his involvement with the Harrow gang, that's hardly surprising. He's likely fled to avoid prosecution." "That's one possibility," Wilson agreed. "The other is that he's still out there and potentially dangerous. He has the most to lose if the truth about his arrangements with Harrow comes to light." "Have you checked his home, his office?" Nate asked, his tactical mind assessing threats. "Mayor Hayes is at the bank now, with the deputy going through Blackwood's papers. Marshal Donovan is questioning the gang members about his whereabouts." Wilson replaced his hat. "In the meantime, I'd advise caution. Keep your doors locked and stay alert until we know where he is." After Wilson had gone, Clara finished bandaging Nate's arm in silence. "It's not over, is it?" she said quietly. "Blackwood is still a threat." "If he's fled, then perhaps we've seen the last of him," Nate replied. "But if he's still in the area..." "He knows I'm the only one who can connect him directly to the Harrow gang," Clara finished. "My testimony could see him hanged for conspiracy to commit murder." "Which makes you a liability he can't afford to leave alive." Nate's voice hardened. "I won't let him harm either of you." Clara studied him. "I believe you. But Nate, you've already fought one battle for us today. This isn't your war." "Isn't it?" Nate challenged gently. "Blackwood targeted you because of me, because Luther Harrow wanted revenge against me. That makes it very much my concern." By late afternoon, Mayor Hayes had returned with disturbing news. Evidence in Blackwood's office revealed he had been embezzling from the bank for years. More alarming was a letter addressed to his brother in Denver detailing how he intended to take care of unfinished business before ending his own life. Clara and Tori, Nate said the pieces falling into place. He sees them as unfinished business. Hayes nodded grimly. That would be my guess. The letter mentioned those who stood in my way and a final reckoning. With Tori safely sent to Joseph Two Rivers camp under the pretense of learning about Shoshone medicine, Nate and Clara fortified the house as best they could, preparing for Blackwood's inevitable approach. As dusk fell, they took positions watching different approaches to the farm. The first hours of darkness passed without incident, but Nate's instincts told him Blackwood would come. Men with nothing left to lose rarely chose flight over a final act of vengeance. Near midnight, during a brief respite for coffee, Clara asked the question that had been hovering between them. When this is over, what comes next, Nate? When it's truly over, what then? Before he could answer, they heard the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel outside. Through the window, Nate spotted a shadow moving from the barn toward the house. Even in the dim moonlight, Ezra Blackwood's distinctive figure was unmistakable. He's coming from the barn, Nate whispered, alone carrying something bulky. As Blackwood drew closer, the object became clear. Kerosene, Clara whispered in horror. He's going to burn us out. I'll circle around behind him, Nate said, already moving toward the back door. You cover the front in case he tries to come in that way. Moving with the silent precision that had once made him Sherman's most valued scout, Nate approached Blackwood from behind. When he was just a few yards away, he deliberately scuffed his boot against the gravel, the sound loud in the night stillness. Blackwood whirled his face, a mask of desperation and fear in the moonlight. That's far enough, Blackwood, Nate said calmly, his revolver aimed at the banker's chest. Step away from the kerosene. You don't understand, Blackwood said, his voice cracking. Everything I built, everything I worked for, it's gone. Because of her. He spat the last word. She was supposed to be grateful for my attention, honored by my proposal. Instead, she humiliated me, refused me time and again. So you decided to kill her and her daughter because she wouldn't marry you. I offered her everything. Blackwood's voice rose hysterically. Protection, security status in the community. Who was she to refuse a widow with no prospects, no family, nothing but that worthless piece of land and her husband's ridiculous medical theories? As he spoke, Blackwood's hand moved subtly toward his coat pocket, a movement Nate recognized all too well. Don't, he warned, his finger tightening on the trigger. Whatever you're reaching for, it's not worth dying for. Blackwood froze, then slowly raised his hands. You won't shoot an unarmed man, he said, a calculating gleam entering his eyes. Not in cold blood. I know about you, Reeves. The great war hero, the man of principle. You had Luther Harrow at your mercy today, and you let him live. You don't have it in you to pull that trigger. It was a gamble, a banker's assessment of risk versus reward. Under different circumstances, Blackwood might have been right. But that was before Nate had seen the kerosene, before he had understood Blackwood's intention to burn Clara and Tori alive in their home. You're right about one thing, Nate said, his voice deadly quiet. I didn't kill Luther Harrow. But he was seeking revenge for his brother's death, misguided but understandable. His expression hardened. You're planning to murder a woman and child because your pride was wounded. Don't mistake mercy for weakness, Blackwood. I won't warn you again. Something in Nate's tone, the cold certainty, the promise of immediate violence, finally penetrated Blackwood's desperate bravado. The sound of approaching riders reached them, Sheriff Wilson and his deputies arriving just in time to take Blackwood into custody. As they led him away, Blackwood turned back once. It wouldn't have lasted anyway. He called a final attempt to wound. Nothing does out here. The land takes everything, eventually hopes, dreams, lives. You'll see. Clara's hand found Nate's in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his in silent refutation of Blackwood's bitter prophecy. Together, they watched the sheriff's party disappear down the road, taking with them the last immediate threat to their safety. It's over, Clara said softly when they were alone again. Really over this time. Yes, Nate agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones, a peace he had not known in 12 long years of running. It's over. Dawn broke over the Watson farm with gentle insistence, painting the eastern sky in delicate washes of pink and gold. Nate stood on the porch, coffee's cup in hand, watching the day emerge with the peaceful vigilance that had become second nature. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, that vigilance was not accompanied by the constant tension of a man expecting danger from every quarter. Clara joined him on the porch, her own coffee steaming in the cool morning air. "You're up early," she commented, leaning against the railing beside him. "Old habits," Nate replied with a slight smile, "though I suppose I could learn to sleep in occasionally." And the casual implication that he might be around long enough to develop new habits hung between them, neither acknowledging it directly, but both aware of its significance. "I should go fetch Tori from Joseph's camp," Clara said after a comfortable silence. "She'll be worried even if Joseph has kept her distracted with stories and lessons." They worked together in the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast, moving around each other with the ease of people accustomed to sharing space. It was a domestic tableau that would have seemed impossible to Nate just days ago, a glimpse of a life he had convinced himself was forever beyond his reach. As they ate, Clara broached the subject that had been implicit in their interactions since the previous night. "Nate," she began, setting down her spoon, "we should talk about what happens next." "Yes, we should," he agreed, meeting her direct gaze. "Thunder's hoof is healing well," she continued. "Another week, perhaps two, and he'll be sound enough for travel." Nate nodded, waiting for her to continue. Clara took a deep breath. "Before you make any decisions about leaving or staying, there's something you should know. Something I haven't told you about my research. James and I were working on a treatment for inflammatory fever," she said, her voice taking on a precise cadence. "The same fever that took your wife and son. The same fever that kills thousands every year, especially in army camps, in crowded cities." "You mentioned that before," Nate said. "You said you were close to completing his work." "Yes," Clara confirmed. "Closer than I realized, in fact." She hesitated. "The night of the storm, after you were asleep, I tried a new formulation combining elements from James's notes with techniques Joseph Two Rivers taught me for extracting certain plant compounds." She rose, moving to the window. "It worked, Nate. The test cultures showed a complete inhibition of the bacteria that caused the fever. I've repeated the experiment 3 times since then, with the same results each time." "You've found a cure," Nate said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For the fever that killed Eleanor and Jacob." Clara turned back to him. "Yes, or at least a treatment that could save many who would otherwise die. It needs more testing, of course, clinical trials with actual patients. But the preliminary results are miraculous." "That's extraordinary, Clara. James would be proud. The medical community will be amazed." "That's just it," Clara said, returning to the table but not sitting. "For this treatment to reach those who need it, to be accepted by the medical establishment, it needs to be presented properly. I've received a letter from Dr. Morgan at Chicago Medical College. He's heard of my work of James's work and has invited me to come to Chicago to develop it further with the full resources of the college at my disposal." The implications were immediately clear to Nate. Chicago, a major city thousands of miles away, a new life for Clara and Tori far from the struggling farm in Wyoming territory. "When would you go?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the sudden hollowness in his chest. "The letter arrived the day before Blackwood came with its ultimatum," Clara explained. "I was going to tell you, but then everything happened so quickly." She shook her head. "Dr. Morgan suggests I come as soon as possible, before winter makes travel difficult." "It's an incredible opportunity," Nate said finally. "For you and for Tori, and for the countless people your treatment could save." "It is," Clara agreed quietly, "but it would mean leaving here, selling the farm, the apothecary, starting over in a city where we know no one." She hesitated, then added softly, "Unless we didn't go alone." The invitation in her words was unmistakable, but Nate found himself struggling to respond. Chicago, a crowded, bustling city, everything he had avoided since the war. "I'm not sure I'd be much use in a medical college," he said, finally attempting a lightness he didn't feel. "Perhaps not," Clara acknowledged, "but Chicago is a growing city. They need men who can build things, repair things. Men with your skills and experience." She met his gaze directly. "Men who have faced their ghosts and learned to live again." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. Joseph Two Rivers was riding into the yard, Tori seated before him on his dappled pony, her face alight with excitement. "Mama," she called as soon as she spotted Clara. "Joseph taught me about healing plants, and I slept in a real teepee." The scene before him, mother and daughter reunited the old healer, watching with quiet approval. The morning sun bathing everything in golden light struck Nate with unexpected force. This was what he had been missing in all these years. Not just human connection, but belonging. A place in the world, a purpose beyond mere survival. As he watched Clara and Tori walk hand in hand toward the house, Nate realized he had a choice to make, perhaps the most important choice of his life, since he had decided to leave his family and join Sherman's special unit 20 years ago. A choice between continued solitude or the risk of connection with all the bond and pain that entailed. Later that afternoon, as he worked on the farm buildings, Clara approached with a letter in hand. "This came with Joseph this morning," she said, extending the envelope toward him. "I forgot to give it to you with everything else happening." Nate took it, noting the official seal of the U.S. Army in the corner. Alone in the barn, he opened the letter, unfolding the crisp official stationery with a sense of trepidation. The signature at the bottom, General William Tecumseh Sherman himself, sent a jolt of surprise through him. The letter informed him that a confidential investigation into the Coal Harrow operation had finally concluded. The findings exonerated Nate and his men completely. Evidence had confirmed they were betrayed not by local civilians, as initially suspected, but by a Union officer who had been bribed by Harrow's associates. Furthermore, subsequent investigation verified Harrow was indeed a profiteer, using the chaos of war for personal gain, responsible for the deaths of dozens of wounded soldiers through his theft of medical supplies. Nate read the letter 3 times, the words gradually penetrating the protective barriers he had built around that painful chapter of his past. Exonerated. The burden of guilt he had carried for 20 years, the belief that his tactical error had cost not only the lives of his men, but indirectly those of his wife and son, lifted by a few lines of official correspondence. As he carefully refolded the letter and placed it in his shirt pocket, Nate felt something shift within him, a loosening of chains so long worn he had ceased to notice their weight. Not absolution, perhaps, but confirmation that the burden he had carried was not rightfully his to bear. That evening, when Tori had gone to bed, Nate and Clara sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. He had shown her Sherman's letter, and she had understood immediately its significance. "So," she said, finally breaking their comfortable silence. "Chicago. Chicago." Nate repeated the word, no longer carrying the dread it had that morning. "Your research deserves to be developed properly, and Tori deserves every educational opportunity." "But," Clara prompted, hearing the unspoken hesitation in his voice. "But I've never lived in a city," he admitted. "It would be an adjustment." Clara's hand found his in the darkness. "We would face it together," she said simply. "All of us." Nate turned to her, finally facing the truth he had been avoiding since the moment Tori had declared her mother needed someone strong, and she needed a father. "Clara," he said quietly, "what I want is to stop running, to build something lasting, something meaningful, to honor Eleanor's final request that I find happiness after her." He took a deep breath. "And I believe that happiness might be found with you and Tori, whether in Chicago or here or anywhere else." "Are you certain?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "This isn't gratitude or obligation speaking." "No," Nate assured her. "It's something I never expected to feel again." "Then it seems we have a decision to make," she said, squeezing his hand. "Chicago or Wyoming." Clara considered this, her practical nature asserting itself. "The research needs to go to Chicago," she said after a moment. "But perhaps we don't need to sell the farm, not immediately at least. We could leave it in Joseph's care, see how we fare in the city. If it proves unsuitable, we would have a place to return to," Nate finished for her. "A home base of sorts." "Exactly," Clara nodded. "And Tori would have the best of both worlds, education and opportunity in the city, with the freedom and connection to nature that the farm provides during holidays and summers. If we're to build a future together," Nate said carefully, "I'd like to do it properly. With your permission and Tori's, I'd like to court you, Clara Watson." A soft laugh escaped Clara, not mockery, but genuine delight at his formal proposal. "Nathaniel Reeves," she said, her eyes dancing with amusement and affection, "are you asking permission to eventually ask me to marry you?" I suppose I am, he admitted with a rueful smile. It's been a long time since I navigated these particular waters. Then let me simplify matters, Clara said, stepping closer. Yes, you may court me. Yes, Tori will be delighted at the prospect. And yes, when the time comes for more permanent arrangements. I believe you'll find my answer has already been decided. With that, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his, a kiss as direct and honest as the woman herself. Nate's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with equal conviction, pouring into it 12 years of denied emotion, finally set free. The next morning, as they sat at breakfast with Tori excitedly discussing their planned move to Chicago, Nate found himself watching Clara across the table, marveling at the strange paths that had led him to this moment. 12 years ago, standing beside the fresh graves of his wife and son, he had believed his capacity for happiness died with them. 12 days ago, arriving at this farm with a wounded horse and a wounded soul, he had still believed it. Yet here he sat, part of a family again, planning a future he had thought forever beyond his reach. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, dancing on the wind before settling gently on the Wyoming earth. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, three people brought together by chance, bound by choice, began the delicate, courageous work of building a family from the fragments of lives broken and remade. Eleanor's final promise, at long last, was being kept. The end.